And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there already. Of course, I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it's been the week of UFO naming week.
Oh?
Yeah, wonderful things like the ASRO. What a catchy
I don't know about
title.
this.
This is the, let's see, Anomaly Surveillance and Resolution Office.
Rolls off the tongue.
Somehow. Brought to you by the lovely intelligence agencies. But the really good one, I'm going to have to read this one. AOIMSG. That's Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group. Try that one. How does that feel?
They're going to have to come up with some kind of snappy little nickname.
This is what I'm thinking. These are very interesting. They're almost intentionally made so that when we get into this, by the way, these are the new little departments that are supposed to handle the UFO information, and so they can manage the whole. Oh, look, there's a threat coming in, and you have to give up even more power and even more money because, unlike COVID, this one is an alien invasion, and it's even worse somehow. As I've said before, if you thought the COVID op was something, just you wait. Just you wait.
Yes, and of course we have an eclipse happening.
Is that it?
Tonight, early this morning for Eastern Standard Time. I think it's 2:00 in the morning.
All right, this is the new moon.
Yes.
Right.
Time for new beginnings, and it is passing over Antarctica, and it has a 6-month window of impact. So expect things to happen in the next 6 months.
Okay.
So new light being shed on things.
I feel reborn somehow. Well, this is interesting, though, because I think there is a lot of new information coming to light. And one of the things we have to really get ready for is our truth. This is the thing, which is the narrative truths that have been spilled out there, that you need the government and, that there's a worldwide emergency and that gives them all the power to strip you of yours. None of this stuff makes any sense. But when you get into the UFO file, it's particularly pernicious because the public has been really good at being kind of open source and sharing information with each other and the stories generation through generation. And all we've had are the CIA and other intelligence groups really blocking that information. And now they're at a point on the CIA side where they want to release a version of it that serves the national security state in a kind of fear panic. And then you have another group who still wants to keep the secrecy going. So now they're fighting in public. One of them's like, look, we're going to run a false op. And the other one's like, no, we want to keep the old secrecy. And the other one's like, well, we're going to run the false op and keep the real secrecy. Don't worry about it. And the other group's like, no, you can't do that because it might let out the real secret. So this is really where they're at. And it's interesting because the people who are behind the ASRO, like Avril Haynes, for example, or KIRSTEN GILLIBRAND, senator from New York, who we discussed last time, they're all perpetuating that CIA threat idea, along with Marco Rubio and a few choice others. There's one unusual guy, and it's hard to see where he stands. He's a Republican congressman from Tennessee, Tim Burchett. And before people go jumping up and down saluting this guy, actually, because he said, oh, we don't need this. I'm going to read it exactly. Airborne Object Identification Management Synchronization Group. I'm going to have to come up with some kind of a name like that. Maybe I'll call it like Annoying Name. We'll just call it that. It's the Annoying Name Agency. So let's see. That's ANA. That's okay. Anna for short. New UFOs likely from deep space, says Representative Tim Burchett. And the first bad sign is that he's talking to TMZ. That's, red flagorama. Of course, that's where Rubio made his, Rubio, senator from Florida, made his big splash. Little Marco, as they say. But this guy really got on board. And, he's sitting there and he's talking about this UFO office. And he's like, Pentagon never shares anything. But the other group, the Intelligence Committee, the ASRO thing, they want everything to go to Avril Haynes on the national intelligence side, the CIA side. So you've got the Pentagon and the CIA, supposedly, but actually it's dueling intelligence forces inside those two groups duking it out. And that's always an interesting period of time. But in the middle of this little tirade that Burchett gives about how the Pentagon is taking over the UFO file thing, this guy's never talked about UFOs before in his life, so this is quite sudden. Then he starts talking about how the government has been keeping the JFK records, which is really true. So it's, it's getting cumulative, where it's almost like too much of a psychotic situation. The situation's become schizophrenic between the public and the leadership. So we've entered into a period here, which is perfect for tonight's episode, the X Series 114. Tonight, this is Deep State UFO Wars. And you know who it features?
One guess.
Lou Elizondo's in there. So we're going to flash backward and forward. And part of it, we're going to go back to the Jim Garrison trial. And we're going to find that Jim Garrison came right up against the UFO file and the X-Protect group. And I'm going to show where Elizondo identifies himself almost directly with X-Protect, believe it or not. I introduced some information about 1.5 years ago about Lou Elizondo. And of course, Elizondo is this intelligence agent who came out and pretended to be a whistleblower and that he was going to get all this information out. And he certainly was in the government, but they sent him out as a counterintelligence guy, which he was quite good at. And the more we got into him, the deeper that hole went. And it's sort of that intelligence, I'll say anything bit. And I want to get a quote here so we know the field of action that we're in. This really sums it up, and you have to keep this in mind when dealing with these people. Now, there's a book that is called A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments by H.B.L. Borelli.
I didn't know you had that.
Oh, yeah. It's quite a good book. And his stuff is really quite interesting. One of the things he does some very interesting sort of deep dives on is the fact that the CIA planted individuals at the ARE, the Casey Foundation, in the 1960s to find out what the deal was with the Hall of Records underneath the Sphinx. This type of information is exactly the bit that he really gets into. And it has a lot to do with their brainwashing techniques. And I'm going to get into him in a little bit here, but one of the quotes that these assassins and people who work in the black projects generally have is that, 1, there is no truth, and 2, we can do anything. This is their credo. So that's the credo from how they're trained in counterintelligence. Anything goes, and there is no truth. So they never have a real firm foundation on anything because they're always just trying to spin a narrative and nothing's ever true. So they come from a kind of an organization of lies, and they're very comfortable in that. So, you can see, just like the COVID op, when you have Biden come out and say these things, Stepford Biden came out and stumbled around today and froze and all that stuff. And now it's almost getting ridiculous pointing out everybody knows it. But what do you do about that? But he comes out and he says, they said, well, do you still want to, stop COVID? Isn't that what you said you were going to do? You're going to stop COVID? And he was like, well, we have to beat it back first. What the hell does that mean? We'll beat it back and then stop it? It's just to say anything. It's like, well, first we have to take it to the moon and come back. They want to perpetuate this from going. And next week they'll have a new variant and all the rest of it because that's the business that they're in. So we have to always keep in mind who we're dealing with. There is no truth. That's their motto. There is no truth. So when we go forward looking into this and we find what Garrison was up against in the 1960s, and then we're going to go further back and see what Kenneth Arnold was up against when he first came out after having seen these saucer-like craft. And his descriptions are actually quite interesting, but what happened to him immediately afterwards is even kind of more fascinating. The fact that some of the people involved in some of those early sightings would stretch out and go into the 50s and 60s and 70s and even 80s tells you that there was a continual thread that was running through all of these operations. And that's what the Deep State UFO File is all about. They have been keeping this information for over 75 years. And what we have to take from all that is the attempts then by legitimate citizens and researchers to try to get that information out was met with a wall of secrecy and ridicule and all the other things that they did. But what's even worse after all that effort is signing on to a lie, which is the thing that they're trying to get everyone to do now with the TTSA and the Lou Elizondo operations. Now, the TTSA was all CIA people. We exposed that here. They expected to come out. CIA gave them a budget of $50 million, which the company's $50 million in debt. They blew that money on all these funny things like History Channel shows and all that stuff, and none of it seemed to work because their charismatic frontman, Lou Elizondo, just wasn't cutting it. Or Tom DeLonge had stepped in it too many times, or Chris Mellon was too much of a nerd to make it work.
Or maybe because they lacked authenticity. Very simple.
Exactly. And I think of that even more so. But, you know, what they kept doing was switching the players. For a while, they'd put Harry Reid, and they say, well, this guy get it because he used to be a senator? No. I'd put George Knapp. George Knapp would promote, like, these different guys like DeLonge. And then when DeLonge wasn't working out too well and he went on Joe Rogan and it really turned out badly for him, then they pumped up Lou. And Lou had a lot of problems because there were guys like me and John Greenwald out there who had seen through a number of the things that he had said, and he had put a number of things on the record that were just completely false. So he was a counterintelligence agent pretending to be a UFO whistleblower. It's kind of a dangerous situation. And the New York Times embraced all that, and then they spread it through all the media, but it still had a really hard time. So during the COVID thing, they kind of resurrected it all, and they sent Lou out with Chris, and they did a lot of things with Elizondo. They started to train him in sound bites and things of this nature, and told him to pause before answers. And you can spot that kind of media training, as we know. It's got a little bit of Pygmalion in there. And
My Fair Lady.
Exactly.
I think she's got it.
There's going to be a very special section on that later. And the funny thing is that even with all that push, the threat aspect still wasn't working. So the UFO threat thing is something the media tried to pull heavy and hard on starting in 2018. And you would find like the Atlantic going, are we in the middle of a full-blown alien invasion? Like weird headlines like that. I have so many of them here. But what I find interesting with the Elizondo piece is that they've resurrected him now, and their new line is hero. We have to kind of keep an eye on this for what they're doing, and also for the weird kind of, I think, steganography that Lou engages in during his interviews and things that I'm going to point out. But I do want to point this out as we start, because we're going to track back the UFO file deception, but we're right at the heart of it when we're dealing with Elizondo now. And the unfortunate thing is that a number of UFO researchers went along with him in the first place, which has really created quite a dynamic.
Which was probably the intention.
I think so. So you have these people who formerly had, a kind of props and a certain amount of gravitas, and you find them just kind of, kissing up to a CIA operation to get in the TV show. I don't know. It's pretty sad to watch. And if you ever get into it with them or question them or whatever, instantly you become the enemy, or they're like, you're mentally unhinged, you're paranoid. CIA is great. I love them. This is a really big problem, though, because when we get into the CIA, a story just came out about the CIA and how within their own ranks they had, cases of real child abuse from their agents, and also
sexual abuse.
Yes.
Don't forget the word child sexual
abuse. It's a gigantic scandal, and I think when you look at it and you see that most of the cases where the CIA found this out were not prosecuted, you see where they're coming from as sort of secrecy at any price. Now, I'm not saying that all CIA people are like that, but there's too much corruption in the ranks of the organization because of the nature of the secrecy itself. And this is why we've had the president who started it, Harry Truman, say, you got to reform it or scrap it. And he was talking about scrapping it in 1963 after the Kennedy assassination. Of course, Kennedy battled it the whole time he was in office. We know the Central Intelligence Agency was involved in that assassination. Anyone who has a real eye for the research and the evidence and the details knows that the government was involved in the assassination, and the media covered it up. And the CIA had incredible control over the media. So when we see these scandals now, we have to remember that groups like the CIA operate in the public in someone else's interest. It's not always in the country's interest. And this is part of the whole deep state aspect. And this is something that Professor Scott has pointed out to us. Professor Scott, who coined the term the deep state, and is a UC Berkeley professor who we've cited many times on this program. He's been on the show many hours. We did a Kennedy special with him. And probably like the most definitive continuity of government episode we did a few years ago with him. But when you understand that aspect, you understand that a CIA is a sort of a core piece of that deep state, along with the whole financial, international finance aspect. So you have to see that interface, and you also have to see that the Central Intelligence Agency was largely set up by lawyers. So it's different than just looking at it from a military angle. You know, the over-militarization has its own problems. You know, it's funny because I was reading a book from 1968 regarding the post effects of the Kennedy assassination. And they were saying, look, Kennedy was against this deep, you know, this kind of Cold War stuff. And here we are spending $20 billion a year on the military. And I was thinking, wow, it's $800 billion a year now. And that's the stuff that's on the record. So that's not even including the black budget. You know, so things just went progressively. If you look back, that's 50 years from when the book was written. And you just see, where does this process end? You know, and we don't even have an active enemy out there in the world right now. And yet the militarization, the industrialization just continues. That military machine grows. Eventually, if they have the power and the ability, they're just going to take over. And that's what we see happening.
What does X say in JFK, the movie, about the organizing power of a state lies with its military powers, right?
Yeah, it's war. That's true, the organizing principle. And well, that's something that Fitz would agree with our central banking warfare model. It doesn't have to be that way. But now they've gone into a different kind of overdrive with the current op. And in the middle of locking people down and doing all this kind of continuity of government style activity and hinting at fascism, you know, with Governor Gavin Newsom coming out and saying, hey, look, I can call martial law anytime I want. No, you can't. Turns out. You know, there's the Constitution you swore to. You're going to get into a lot of trouble if you do that. So, you know, these are the types of problems we have. And right in the middle of all these things that they're doing that lean so heavily into fascism and show, you know, foreign powers involved, like the Chinese Communist Party, and the Davos crowd sitting back and, you know, just working on it. This is what we're talking about. You know, we're really looking at a situation where we're going to have, you know, to really take a deep look at what's going on, because in the middle of all that, what did they do? They dropped out the UFO file, and they came out with all the same Pentagon videos that supposedly Chris Mellon, who, remember, worked Defense Intelligence for W, he came out and he said, look, you know, I got these in a parking garage, and just created this whole phony Watergate scenario. And he's like, they passed them to me, and oh, I gave them to the New York Times, and the brave reporters there, like Leslie Kean, Lou's best friend, who just has a HBO special that she wrote, which is a bio of Lou and Chris that they're going to be putting out. I mean, it's getting ridiculous, right? And you have these big publishers putting out Lou's book and all that stuff. I mean, I don't care, except that the insidious nature of what they're doing on the CIA side with this is the real aspect and the real problem.
Well, that it's leading up to something.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
But it is so, the awakening of humanity is undeniable. It is so easy now to see an op that they they have to keep singing and dancing, right? To sort of hide what they're up to make it, to keep it going, because I think people are seeing through all of it, and it is that because people want truth. Right? Like as John Lennon said, just give me some truth. At this point, we really need it. And we can perceive the lies and the contempt they have for us for believing their lies for so many decades.
This is the nature of the thing, and you're absolutely right. What's funny is when you think about it, we're ready for the truth, but we're also in the biggest position to be scammed ever. Because you know, it's the technological aspect which everyone has gotten involved in, and I think that we should. Don't get me wrong. I ran a tech magazine for 10 years. I'm not someone who objects to technology. I'm very into it. However, the way that it's operational right now, and the way that it's being used, and the automation is being used, and depopulation is being planned, these are the types of things which any you know, open-minded free society would talk about. And when you engage in these things, you get thrown off networks, you get shadow banned, you get your tweets deleted. I mean, it's quite ridiculous. But that's the only way, because they are a minority. They're a small minority that's running this. And the idea that, you know, there's just a much bigger group of us out there, and they're trying to control them. They're trying to control us. And so the problem is, when they look at it, they look out and they say, we have to control that conversation. But when they do it, it looks ridiculous to us, because we're like, what? You think that that's going to stop anybody? You just censored the president of the United States, as they did in 2020 during the election. You know, you're going to censor the New York Post, whether you like the New York Post or not. I mean, you can't censor it, right? That's not the right way to do it. So we're seeing a lot of this. So we have to kind of wrap our heads around it and say, why are they running down the ball field so fast? Why are they heading for that end zone? And if they crash into a golf cart in the way, they don't care, because they're just going insane time-wise to do some of these things. That's what we're going to try to answer tonight in this X series 114, which is the Deep State UFO File Wars. Those wars happen, and X-Protect is right in the heart of them. And X-Protect is the group that we identified early on here. And I'm going to explain some of the terms tonight so we know what we're talking about. But just to finish up on that Lou piece, so GQ now has made Lou one of their heroes. We can be heroes just like Lou. And so it says, this man ran the Pentagon's secretive UFO program for a decade. We had some questions, right? And by the way, GQ now is doing a thing where, to be hip, they're like, did you ever say, I can't effing believe it? You know, like,
yeah,
it's so
they
ridiculous.
all are.
They're like swearing in their articles. It's embarrassing, you know, especially when you look at, you know, some of the people who interview them. It's like, you know, they've probably never sworn in their entire lives. So here are some very interesting things. Remember, X-Protect now is the covert intelligence aerospace group that controls the UFO file. That is the group that we identified in our documentary, and we went through decade after decade to do it. So we went all the way through the 50s and 60s and brought it up to date with the Space Force, which tonight we're going to do something very similar. But listen to some of these things. Before you were approached to be part of ATIP, you were a counterintelligence special agent hunting terrorists and drug traffickers. Why did they approach you? Good question. I have no idea. I think it was probably because I wasn't prone to any flights of fancy. One thing I want to point out about Lou is that I had somebody who was involved in one of the big UFO cases out of New York, and he claimed that when he was interrogated after he reported this all to the police, he had to wait around, and then they sent a military guy in to interrogate him, and then that this guy followed him around for 6 months. And then in 2017, when Lou came out, he was like, oh my God, that's the guy who was following me. So Elizondo had a career as a spook, chasing around those who had been contacted or had seen UFOs. He never talks about that. So this idea of, why did they contact you to do ATIP, which is supposedly to study UFOs? And he's like, I have no idea, you know. That's more CIA dancing. He should have said, well, they employed me to, you know, chase after different abductees. So he goes, I wasn't a particular fan of science fiction. I do have some background in advanced aerospace technology. Keep that in mind. When I was a young special agent, I did Tech Protect. Yeah, Tech Protect. Counterintelligence work to stop U.S. technology from falling into enemy hands. X-Protect, in fact, is Tech Protect. So
That's
this is
too close for comfort. I can't believe it.
It's quite a jump. I did Tech Protect, counterintelligence work to stop U.S. technology from falling into enemy hands of advanced avionics. And my background was a scientist at university. Yeah, he developed weird pathogens and weird illnesses, and he patented some diseases. One of the weird things about TTSA I found in general is that they all seem to have some kind of medical background. I had 3 majors: microbiology, immunology, and parasitology. You came to this not particularly caring about UFOs, but I have read there was a moment when you said to yourself, holy F, this is real. What was that moment? It's funny because the people in the office kind of giggled and they were like, oh, he just had his epiphany, because eventually everyone had one in that office. Yeah, the CIA office. Huh? There's a lot of epiphanies going on there. But this is the thing. So GQ Heroes, book contracts, movie bio, that's the way it rolls. The CIA controls the media and they control, that kind of HBO rollout. It's very easy for them to tap the right people. And then you get the other kind of CIA contacts like Leslie Kean, whose uncle, of course, was Governor Thomas Kean, who headed up the 9/11 Commission. I mean, these are deep political movers and shakers. By the way, and I don't want to say anything, odd about Kean, but she's very cagey about her own past and didn't identify where she went to college for 25 years until 3 weeks ago. There was no way around it because she's surrounded by all these people asking the same question. And then she finally lets it out. And big deal, it was a fancy college. But the whole point is that there's a lot of strangeness with her. And I have to point it out because Kean was the partner for 10 years of Bud Hopkins, live-in, romantic partner. And Hopkins was the #1 abductions guy. Well, she stays away from all the abduction stuff, and that's fine and well. But to not ever mention Bud Hopkins when they talk to her about her past, she's like, oh, I wrote an article about UFOs in the 90s, and ever since I've been really into it, That's not true. Bud Hopkins took you into all that, and he shared his life with you and all of his stuff with you for 10 years, and that set so much of your mind up about what you were doing on the UFO file. Now, the only reason somebody wouldn't mention that is she doesn't want people to mention it to her. So you have to wonder about that, and a lot of people have said that Kean was kind of a plant in the UFO field. And I don't know. But I will say this. It's weird that she cozies up and she's writing Lou's biography and all this stuff because he's from the CIA. Aren't people who are into the UFO file and study UFO research, aren't they supposed to be kind of anti or at least suspicious of the CIA? So why are people like Knapp and Dolan and Kean all wrapped around this guy's finger? It's really disturbing. And that's really where we find ourselves.
Well, and why wouldn't you want to honor the person that you spent a decade of your life with?
Yes.
and keep his memory alive in the community?
Yes.
To never mention his name is very strange.
Think about Hopkins. Hopkins was remarkable because his work was all around regressions and he became the main guy. But what he did, it was his work that drew in John Mack over here at Harvard. And Mack in 1998 was writing about the abduction experience because of all the things that he'd done with Hopkins. Now, whenever the CIA wants to get rid of, a memory hole, something, it's because they can't contend with an aspect of it. I've pointed this out in relation to certain things in the 60s. And I think there's a big flash fight right now over Bob Dylan's legacy. You see all kinds of things about Bob Dylan right now, positive and negative. And you see companies, shadowy companies, buying up his entire song catalog. And also, you have weird things like these museums that are kind of capturing all of his data. And I think that when we look at Dylan, we're seeing somebody who's kind of a flashpoint of a particular era, but certainly he was associated with revolution and with the working class and all of these types of things. So I think that when they have people look back at these eras, they don't want them to look back and see, oh, the 60s, you know, there's this whole humanist aspect alive. There's this whole, you know, relationship to ideas that people matter. And so that whole corporate thing coming in and coming after you. Now, I'm not saying that Dylan has been particularly politically active lately. He did put out a 17-minute song that was all about the JFK assassination in 2020. And right after that, he got hit with a bunch of charges from like 1965 that like, oh, he assaulted some girl in a hotel room. And, you know, whatever. I mean, there's so many things that happen in the music industry, and, you know, I'm sure that case will play itself out. I don't know the merits of the case. Maybe it does have merit. However, you know, to come up with a case like that 55 years later just seems a little bit suspicious. So I think that Dylan is in play in some of that narrative work that they're doing. So we have to remember with the CIA, it's always about the things that they can get rid of and the things that they can memory hold. It's just like the 1984 story.
Well, it's all about criticizing the establishment, right?
Yeah.
Those in power. That's what Dylan did. That's what protest songs were all about.
Yes.
Was power to the people, not the people who were actually in control.
And that's the thing about protests too, because we see so many protests that the media won't cover. Italy, Germany, Australia, Austria. You know, these people are pushing back against those ridiculous. I mean, we see real outright fascism in the international crisis of Australia. It's outrageous. This is an international crisis that should be before the UN every day until those people are lifted up out of that situation. This has gone crazy. They're grabbing people and bringing them to camps. I mean, it's, and this is the Wall Street Journal reporting that. That's not a blog, you know, and the blog is probably telling the truth anyway. But even in the mainstream side, they're like, you know, they're repurposing mining camps and getting great results, shoving people in them. I mean, what the hell is going on here? They're trying to normalize camps. Are you crazy? So the first thing is everybody should be howling about Australia. It's an international crisis.
Najat Madri says, did DJ hear Pelosi's latest rant that people should respect government?
Yes.
Sounding more Chinese, right?
She's like,
CCP.
I follow orders.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we'll get into more of this. Of course, Australia, deep in Black Aerospace and the UFO File, Pine Gap, forget it, you know, hardcore. I wanted to mention that this is one of 6 shows dealing, this is part 1 of 6 shows dealing with the deep state UFO file aspect. And we're going to bring all that together at the end of it with, you know, a big kind of summary. But each part, each aspect of these is going to be crucial. And tonight we're going to be dealing with Kenneth Arnold, Jim Garrison, Fred Krisman, Lou, Kirsten Gillibrand, all kinds of goodies. So we're going to be getting into that. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That keeps us in touch without any interference at all from the social media networks, which are here today, gone tomorrow. But I will say this, that for me, in looking out at it, you know, the best way for us to stay in touch and have that direct pipeline is the newsletter, because I can email you directly about what's going on, the incredible shows we have going on. If the networks ever went down, we have our own video server that we could repurpose and directly start that through the newsletter. So it's important to be on that list. It's a free newsletter. And you get it once a week just to let you know what shows are coming up, and the incredible, and I mean incredible, shows that we have coming up for December and January with some remarkable guests. We just did a show with Gigi Young that got such great feedback. And of course, a 3-part series with Dr. Joseph Farrell we just did, and some of the really exciting people coming up as well. So just remarkable. Make sure you're on that.
Okay, 2 things. World Change Brief says, and New Zealand, please don't forget us. We entered apartheid society today. No vax means you can't go to any establishments now.
Oh.
And World Change Brief also wanted you to repeat the name of the new UFO, the ANA, when you can.
The ANA, yes, it is. And that is annoying name, Anomaly. This is AOIMSG, Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group. They announced this at the Pentagon. And what I did find, which I found a little dicey, is that you know, all the people associated around the CIA side were objecting to this. And so suddenly all these people like Corbell and Elizondo and Knapp were coming out of the woodwork objecting to this, when it's exactly the same as their ASRO thing. You know, it does, I mean, basically it's saying that it's going to do the same thing, but they're like, hey, look, you know, this is our CIA thing. The CIA promised us all this stuff. And now if the CIA doesn't control the UFO file and the Pentagon keeps it, we don't get to stay in that loop. So we're all upset. So that's not really, you know, those researchers and those people aren't really on the side of the public. They're just on the side of whoever butters their toast, you know, and that's not really how you do research. So I'm embarrassed for those people getting behind that op, and I'm going to try to do the real stuff, and I'm going to try and not pay attention to the lame things that are going on in that end of the field. Because, you know, for me, I've been involved in one way or another around this kind of dark journalism most of my life. And, you know, so I've known and I've watched those people in the alternative research world, because that's where I come from. And so to see them get involved with this stuff is it's unbelievable. It's very shocking even now. So
what's your dad's big quote?
What is it?
About the chemical companies?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, he knew it. He knew it back then. Unbelievable. And I would definitely say that, you know, when we're looking at this stuff and all these people signing on just to try to get in the next documentary or whatever, look, you have so much media available to you. You actually don't need, that's a kind of an old idea that, oh, I need Hollywood to discover me and make me a documentary. I mean, if you can reach, you know, if you reach 100, we did 150,000 viewers for our documentary. You know, if you're reaching 150,000 viewers that are showing, and you know that Google shadow bans you, it's probably twice as many. And then there's all those other places where they, you know, republish the videos or whatever. So the spread of even that documentary is probably over 1 million viewers, right? So do you really, ask yourself, honestly, like, is it worth it to sell out for like HBO or Netflix or something like that? Really? In this day and age, it's not.
Well, and we've talked about the people who killed Kennedy, or, you know, were participated in that, and how some of them didn't even live for 10 years afterwards.
Oh, that's a whole interesting, yes. When you look back to that period, I mean, it's really quite remarkable because, you know, Guy Bannister, who features heavily tonight, he's dead the year, he doesn't even last a whole year after the Kennedy assassination. So all that stuff that he did, was basically to be undone, right? Even LBJ, who participates, he's only going to live another 9 years or something, you know, and J. Edgar Hoover will be dead. You know, like all these people who participate in all this stuff, big deal. They pull off this big thing and then they're dead 5 or 10 years later. I mean, you know, what makes power and control that valuable, you know, that you're willing to commit acts like that just for very short-term gain? And although it's, you know, when you think about researchers and stuff, I think of it more as kind of selling out. And I actually think it's good, like when people do research and you have all these different departments of things and everyone does their own thing. I actually don't even like to comment on other people's research very much. Problem is that the CIA has influenced so many people around the field, and they know how to get control of people and narratives, that you can't stay quiet about that kind of stuff. So I think the rule has to be, when the CIA comes in, especially identifying themselves and saying, look, we're CIA and we're taking over your field. By the way, meet all our wonderful CIA agents who are suddenly so interested in abductions and all this other stuff and want to help and give you answers, you know, or give you secret files. It's ridiculous. So just one simple rule: no CIA in the UFO field. It's pretty easy. I think it's a pretty respectable rule.
I think the problem is that the CIA is everywhere, like a cancer.
Yeah,
no, just in everything, right?
Yes,
there isn't an industry where they don't have tentacles that have taken over.
It is. And, this is not like, a sort of a paranoid flight of fancy. If you research the Central Intelligence Agency, you find them at the heart of the whole explosion of information about Wuhan and all this stuff and COVID when it came out. They were right at the heart of it, promoting all this. You find them at the heart of Russiagate. Remember the false thing trying to remove President Trump. And again, if you like Trump or don't like him, it doesn't matter. You don't want the CIA removing presidents, which, they were pretty good at, because that's a banana republic, right? So even if it's not your team, you still don't want them to do that. I don't want them to remove Stepford Biden. I mean, they're the ones who put him in there. But, any of those presidents, you don't want the CIA calling the shots on that. And that's the fundamental thing, too, to understand about the CIA, which is fundamentally it's an extra constitutional force. It's not foreseen in the Constitution, and so therefore it upsets the balance of power generally. And then they accumulated more and more and more. If you just get into that history a little bit, of course, Truman's famous quote about them early on was, "I don't want to create American Gestapo, so no." But eventually they talked him into it, and we have an American Gestapo. Now we have two. You have the Department of Homeland Security, and that's 250,000 employees. That's a lot of money, and that's a lot of seeking into people's lives. That didn't exist before 9/11. And you could say, oh, the times have changed. Well, if that's the kind of change, then we need to go back and reset things because, we're not under, this is not 9/11. And we're under the emergency rules of 9/11. That's the problem. We need to remove that state of emergency because that's what's being exploited over and over again. And when we get into the COVID mess and the lockdowns and all that stuff, that's all under emergency rulings as well. There's nothing constitutional about any of this stuff. And more importantly, no force of law. So we're finding ourselves in a very tricky situation. And one of the ways I think we get out of it is to see who are the players. And sometimes when we look at the players, we have to go back in time and unravel some of those black projects from the period. So when the UFO file came out in 1947 on a wide scale, it had already been rumbling around at least for a decade. Not going into the more ancient aspects or the airships and things like that, but just the real kind of CIA scanning of the skies for this flap of UFOs showing up, and the media being extra drawn into it. This all happens in 1947 in earnest. There are earlier cases like Cape Girardeau in 41 where Harry Truman's involved already. But by 47, you have the really kind of hardcore piece. And Arnold is right at the heart of it. Arnold is, he's a private pilot, and he has a business where he kind of goes back and forth, and he works in like the prevention of fire industry for aviation. So he kind of works with airports. He's, he's a very experienced pilot, and he's well known and well liked and well respected. And so when he's over Mount Rainier in Washington, he sees some very unusual craft flying in a strange formation, and there are 9 of them. And there are pictures, it's funny, whenever we look at the pictures, we see with Arnold something kind of fascinating, which is that the pictures don't look like saucers at all. They are these kind of crests, half moon type images. And those things, the first thing that he noticed about them is that they were blinding. So he was double checking himself, thinking there's a craft that's too close to him, etc. But as it turned out, he saw them eventually directly in front of him. They were flying past him, and he was looking out in the distance, and there they were. Now, when he got back, he started to talk to different people about this and say, did you see, have you heard anything about this? And other people had said, hey, look, other people have reported this on the ground. It wasn't just Arnold. There were a number of people who saw this. And instantly, there was a large media contingent that caught on to this. I don't really know, except for the fact that, people were very kind of nervous because it was just after World War II. But it does seem like it coalesced quite quickly with his announcement, and the story spread really rapidly. And there are some other interesting factors going on, which is that the next day there was going to be a major air show close by. Here's another odd factor. There was a transport plane that had gone down in that area, and they were offering a $5,000 reward if you could go into those mountains and find it. So there were already odd things happening on the aerospace side before Arnold had his sighting. But when he does touch down, he will later have more experiences, by the way, of seeing craft. That wasn't his only experience. But suddenly, different people get interested in him. And one of the people is named Ray Palmer, and Palmer has a magazine, and he says, you know, I've heard of this other case, and it's over on Maury Island. And Maury Island, you know, it looks like these two guys were on a boat. They saw a craft that sounded kind of like your craft, and you know, something was coming off of it and burned their boat. You might want to check it out. I'll cover your expenses. And they sent him there almost as like a private detective with aviation experience. So he goes there, and he had no idea what he was getting into with it, because the story was big enough, but weird things started to happen. For example, on his way to Maury Island, when he gets into town, and the town is packed, and he can't find a hotel room, and he calls these different hotels, and then one of the hotels he calls says, "Yes, Mr. Arnold, your room is ready." And he says, "What do you mean my room is ready? I haven't ordered it yet." He said, "Oh yeah, it's all here, you know, Kenneth Arnold, like, you're coming in today." And he's like, "All right, okay." And then later, during the run of the case, when he's interviewing witnesses, and the witnesses are most unique, then he's getting these strange calls, and they're saying, "I can tell you everything that you just did. You know, I can tell you that, you know, you have a towel around your neck, you're reading a newspaper, you just got off the phone with so-and-so." And the surveillance was so tight that he was like, they must have like a, you know, a dictaphone in here. That's the way that he thought at the time. But it's such total audio video surveillance on him that he starts to sense there's something up with this case that I'm investigating. And also he's starting to wonder about his own sighting. And originally he was like, this must be experimental aircraft or anything. He wasn't even suggesting aliens. But now that he's getting into it and people are kind of respecting him as an authority on this, things are changing for him. He's under very deep surveillance. And I think it affected him deeply. His life went kind of very strangely after this. And he's a very earnest guy. He was from Boise, Idaho. He had a family, and he had a kind of a reputation for honesty. But he set off, you know, with his sighting, this massive wave of interest. And what happens is that there are so many cases around that period. So his case happens June 23rd, and then July 3rd into July 4th is the Roswell incident, which gets reported on the 7th. So we're right in that window. And then there's a major case in Arizona and another one in New Mexico. So there's a whole wave there. And some people have surmised that those are all part of the same wave of UFOs. There's all kinds of ideas about that wave in 47. One of them is that, you know, there were a number of Crowley-ish things going on in the desert, and that they opened some kind of a portal and let the UFOs in. Another is that the atomic explosions going on between 45 and 47 opened some kind of parallel dimension, and these things came in. And another is that in setting off these nuclear explosions, aliens were very curious what we were doing setting off nuclear fission. So, you know, there's also the obvious, which is just there was a wave of UFO sightings, like the time had come in humanity's life to see these things and acknowledge them. And that's kind of the way that it worked out. But our reaction to them was quite interesting, because at first, although the Roswell case covered up, etc., there is kind of an openness to the idea. And I think humanity was certainly ready on many levels to deal with the alien factor. And that what happens is the X-Protect group coalesces very quickly inside the Central Intelligence Agency corridor with the aerospace companies. And they create this loop of secrecy. They want to study it. They want their, the advantages from studying it. They already have a history on it. So they're starting off ahead of the rest of us by a long shot. And I never bought the idea that like, oh, they're all so surprised and they have to cover it up because it was just after World War II and they don't want to scare world-weary populations and things like that. Actually, I don't think that that's true. I think that the secrecy is embedded in that system. And that's why they called in Vannevar Bush. And Vannevar Bush controlled the UFO file, but his training in secrecy had come from being the head of the Masonic Lodge at MIT. And that kind of secrecy that the Masons have worked very well for compartmentalization of the UFO file. That's how they were able to keep that secrecy. And of course, the Manhattan Project and the immense secrecy around that. So we start to learn instantly that secrecy is a way of life for those people, as it is with governments generally. But around the UFO file, it became an obsession. And, for many, many decades, we saw that researchers would come up, they'd have good theories, they would be solid people, astronomers, and scientists, and all the rest of it, like Morris Jessup, and then they'd be taken out very quickly. So when we think about that, we have to remember the stakes that are involved for them, which is if they lose control of the UFO file, what happens? And very often people say, well, this is really related to the fact that they weren't ready to tell us about aliens. That's partially true, but I believe there's something else that we've identified in this program. And that has to do with the X technology that resides in the UFO file. And the X technology is not just about flying saucers or alien life or UFOs. It goes beyond that, but they also are part of that. So the X technology is something, even there are echoes of it in our remote past with Atlantis and things of this nature. But then the big updates when we get to Nikola Tesla and Keely and this type of research, they also touch upon it. So we're already getting into the X technology. And so the X technology that is developed or understood has a quality to it, as does the UFO generation, which is, I put a name on the quality, which is Apotheum, Apotheum. That might not be a regular word, but it'll do for our purposes. Apotheum is a reality distortion field. And over again, when they ran into this, they realized that it had the ability to upset all the physics that they understood. So in a way, and I think the way Joseph Farrell describes this is, it made the atomic bomb look like a firecracker. So it's such an amazing changeover that they decide complete secrecy, and anything for that secrecy is adequate. So they decide not to share anything with the public. And as decades go by, the public is more and more out of the loop. And it seems like there are forces inside that establishment that are just leaking out ideas about it to see how the public will react. But it's not an adult conversation. It's kind of like feeding little things out to a child, and what happens generally in science is, you get somewhere, you get to a certain level of understanding, like they're doing with age extension now. And then somebody else, another doctor, chimes in on your research, you keep going up this ladder. But if that whole process is removed, you get a splitting off going on. And so now we have this tiny group running this sort of transhumanist automation push, and the whole UFO file thing is wrapped up in that. And the regular society is going off sideways, being like, pushed around basically and given mandates and told they can't show up to work and all the rest. So this is a very imbalanced, problematic situation. But for me, the heart of so much of it goes back to this imbalance of understanding and information about the UFO file. We're going to try to crack more of that as we go tonight. And Arnold is a very good place to go. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight here, X Series 114. These are deep state UFO wars. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. And of course, Miss Olivia is putting those together right now. How's it going out there?
Going great. David Termita says, DJ, Leslie Kane's great-great-grandfather, William Lloyd Garrison, whom she draws inspiration from, is also the grandfather of Oswald Garrison Villard, whose son was a major player for the UFO File.
That is really interesting. And the name loops extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
You know that the Fish family is deep in there as well, I'm sure. But those are great. Think about that.
Melanie K wanted to know, have you seen the new Canadian UFO coin? I haven't. I hadn't heard of it.
You know, I have seen it. And there are little kind of head fakes that they're doing on these types of things generally. And it seems like every once in a while there's a big push, like NASA going to Mars and all this stuff. And then it quiets all down to nothing. And like, they're like, we're going back to the moon in 2024. The first woman is going to be on the moon. And then, like, you know, a few months later, they're like, actually, we're not going back to the moon. And like, Pence wasn't quite accurate. It'll be more like 2028. You know, like, are these weird marketing campaigns? And they're like, William Shatner went into space with Jeff Bezos, whatever. And it's true. But, you know, I mean, it's barely into space, you know. It's just kind of up there in the atmosphere. So there's a lot of ploys going on along this line. And I think that it plays into what we're talking about tonight because they're all using this X-Steganography. And I think that holds a very big key for us. All right, let's do a quick thing here on Avril Haynes. I try to bring up Avril Haynes every time I talk about the UFO file. Now, she's somebody who's been given the ball. She is the DNI, and as the Director of National Intelligence, is technically at the top of our intelligence community. However, the CIA director still runs the show, in fact. But now she wants to talk about UFOs, right? This is her thing, like, oh, there might be aliens out there. So this is the approach that they want to take. She is part of the ASRO push. All of that push came through, you know, Avi Loeb, the Galileo Project. We're going to check out scientists going into space, and Oumuamua was an alien probe and all that. And Avi Loeb's office is, you know, like 5 or 6 minutes from here. And he put together this group. And then suddenly that group got all militarized. And they had Elizondo, counterintelligence in there. And they had Mellon, you know, defense intelligence in there. So it's all military and defense intelligence people now, completely tanking the credibility. And then if you go back and look at his past, Loeb, who's the big Harvard scientist, who's the first one who's allowed on the record to talk about the UFO thing. I mean, Mac did it, but he wasn't allowed. They tried to like take his tenure away. In fact, he didn't have the right timing. He wasn't.
That's how you know he was authentic.
Right. He wasn't knighted by the Queen's
He didn't
Jubilee.
have his own documentary. Exactly. He wasn't on the cover of GQ.
No, in fact, when they put him on Time magazine, it was like, you know, how can they let this man teach or whatever? It was like one of those takedowns. And they're so good at that now. Anytime you get a doctor who says anything but the company line, you know.
Canceled.
Like Malone or anybody else. You know, this guy invented the technology, you know. But I can tell you this, which is when we look at the space of the UFO file and where it's at right now, they're trying to get Avril Haynes to lead this Avi Loeb thing and then keep the military stuff pushed back in the side there so that they can use it, but that nobody knows that they're really gearing up for it to create just massive amounts of money for military purposes and control, and ultimately for a false UFO threat, which a lot of people are throwing in for at that level. Instead, in the first push for the UFO threat, I think they stumbled around talking about this. And programs like ours and others really called out the UFO threat aspect and said, that's a ploy. And So now they're trying to say, oh, we need to study. And, even when they send Elizondo out now, he's like, I want to study consciousness. After interrogating people in Iraq and, doing counterintelligence on people, I want to study consciousness. I'm St. Lou, I want to show you the better way, and the CIA will embrace you. I mean, the CIA, it's an interesting thing, but their function, even in their weird upside down criminal world, their function has nothing to do with like human origins or anything like that. So the fact that they push that, or that they plant people in the Casey Foundation trying to find out about the Hall of Records, is a little creepy, let's face it.
Understatement.
I mean, those people want to be like, let's find Noah's Ark so we can pretend that, like, we're kings and that we were descended from Noah's Ark, or that there was a Noah's Ark on Mars, and that it was the World Economic Foundation, that whole thing. The whole idea of these people thinking of themselves on these higher levels is really quite laughable. And the CIA in particular, the function that they serve is that they have to be very good liars because of the spy work that they do. So the last thing you would expect from them is the truth. So when you get like World Economic Forum people like Schwab and things like that, you can just picture in his head, he'll be like, and then we will find these wonderful ruins on Mars and say that our families came from them and therefore have the right to lead the human race. I mean, I can picture it very easily that that's where they're going. And of course, Gigi Young is big on that one too. So, and you should hear her impersonation. But the way I look at it is, it's so obvious they need a narrative for leadership, because they're, in a sense, so many of the masks have fallen with them. So many people see beyond the media. But there's enough power that they have over the social media companies, over the technology, over the news media, that they keep enough people entranced. And that's really the nature of the problem. So I think that we have to say to ourselves, it's good if the work that we do impacts all of society and causes these ripples all around. That's great. But it's not like the kind of thing we want to wait around for. We want to get on the road with doing the things that we're going to do, and I think Fitz has talked about this too, which is, what she says is Mr. Global, when their op fails, the total lockdown, pharmaceutical control, the UFO threat is the way I look at it. When they do that part and it fails, it's going to be ugly. It's going to be like Berlin after the war. And so her thing is, what are we going to pick up the pieces with? That's why we can't really wait around just to see if humanity wakes up and fights this thing off. We already have to be engaged in that process. And, that starts even with groups like what we're doing right here and in the ideas room and these types of things. It is the conversation that's going to propel us onward. And that's something to keep in mind as we go forward on this. Okay, I'm going to jump back to our friends deep back in time, early in time, to find out how the UFO File piece got screwed up and who took control of this. And also there are pieces back there that show very plainly that there was transparency, that people were aware. And if we can key into some of that awareness before the disinformation sits in, that's something else.
Before you go into that, I was about to ask you, let's just get really clear. When this first started, you think there wasn't control. You think but it was asserted at some point.
No question. Yeah.
So how soon was it asserted? Roswell?
Almost immediately.
Okay.
Yeah, almost immediately. And I think that in 1941 with the Cape Girardeau case, if you go into that, I did an episode with Linda Moulton Howe on this, and Paul Blake Smith was the book she was drawing from. And he's done some good work around that. But basically, again, the Masonic secrecy aspect was active. And this is kind of what catapulted Truman, because he now had a role in the UFO file. Because there was a crash in Cape Girardeau. And there are unusual things about Cape Girardeau in history, generally. But the crash that happened there and the bodies and stuff, there's a very interesting story about these two sisters whose dad was a minister, and they sent the minister out to give last rites to what they thought were plane crash victims. And when he got there, he realized that these are aliens, dead aliens. That's 41, 6 years before Roswell. So even the case with Maury Island involves a kind of mystery magic metal, which happens weeks later in Roswell. So there's something going on there with crashes and things. In the case of Maury Island, if we go back into that case, what happens is that there's a guy who's a logger who works on a boat getting these logs that kind of get away from these lumber companies. And his name is Harold Dahl, and he's a big backwoods guy. And his boss is a fast-talking guy with a lot of secretive military OSS connections and everything else, living out there as well, named Fred Krisman. Crisman is so interesting and so important to the UFO story and the deep state story. He's like a parallel track man. But Dahl basically reports to him that these craft went over the boat and it looked like 6 donuts, and that they were round and they were kind of like had holes in the middle, and they're just circulating around, and it looks like one of them is having a really hard time. So 2 craft are hovering around it, basically trying to get it back up to normal. And it basically jettisons all of this stuff all over his boat, which is sort of like hot metal, slag, as they call it. And it kills his dog, it burns his son's arm, and it causes damage to the boat. So when he goes back to Crisman, somehow Palmer picks up this story that this happened to these 2 guys. That's how Arnold gets involved with it. And then Arnold shows up unawares, like, hey, I just had this very interesting sighting of my own, and now I'm going to talk to these guys because I'm getting paid by this Palmer guy. And he goes down there, and all these weird things start to happen to him. And I'm going to read, actually, a couple of quick things from his book, which I find very interesting and often overlooked. And I don't know why, because it's called The Coming of the Saucers. This is an original magazine ad. It's about 10 years after his sighting. And there he is, Arnold, getting into the plane that he saw the craft in initially in the first place. So a couple of odd things happen now. This is the story that Dahl is telling to Arnold about it. He says, on June 21st, 1947, in the afternoon, about 2 o'clock, I was patrolling the east bay of Maury Island, close into the shore. This practically uninhabited island lies directly opposite the city of Tacoma, about 3 miles from the mainland. This day, the sea was rather rough, and there were numerous low-hanging clouds. I, as captain, was steering my patrol boat close to the shore of a bay on Maury Island. On board were 2 crewmen, my 15-year-old son, and his dog. As I looked up from the wheel of my boat, I noticed 6 very large donut-shaped aircraft. I would judge that they were about 2,000 feet above the water and almost directly overhead. At first glance, I thought them to be balloons, as they seemed to be stationary. However, upon further observation, 5 of these strange aircraft were circling very slowly around the 6th one, which was stationary in the center of this formation. It appeared to me that the center aircraft was in some kind of trouble, as it was losing altitude fairly rapidly. The other aircraft stayed at a distance of about 200 feet above the center one, as if they were following the center of one down. The center aircraft came to rest almost directly overhead, about 500 feet above the water. All on board our boat were watching these aircraft with a great deal of interest, as they apparently had no motors, propellers, or any visible signs of propulsion. And to the best of our hearing, they made no sound. In describing the aircraft, I would say they were at least 100 feet in diameter. Each had a hole in the center, approximately 25 feet in diameter, and they were all some sort of shell-like gold and silver color. Their surface seemed of metal and appeared to be buried when the light shone on them through the clouds. They were brilliant, not all one brilliance, but many different types of brilliances, something like a Buick dashboard. Now, here's what's so interesting. I've never heard of UFOs that had a circle in the middle that you could see through. So he's looking at something that's quite unique. And these are different craft than what Arnold sees, which again have that crescent shape. So these are totally different, even though they're right in the same timeline here and only separated by a couple of days. So, but it is interesting that if you look at Mount Rainier and Maury Island, they're, you know, you're still in that Pacific Northwest region. And so I would say that there's the fact that people look at this case and say that there's something between these two cases that they have in common. I think it is true, but the craft are very different. And also the fact that this guy's seeing multiple craft, just like Arnold saw multiple craft, is also interesting. So what proceeds from here is that Dahl, the big logging guy with the son, gets his son some medical attention for his burnt arm, and he comes back, and he's visited the next morning by this guy in a well-dressed guy in a black suit. And this is the first Men in Black experience. And this guy takes him out and talks to him and says, you know, I want to know more about your business. And he thinks this guy, you know, Dahl thinks he's a potential customer. And he takes him out to breakfast at this very fancy place. And he's like, look, you can't talk about what happened yesterday. And he details exactly what happened, when they went out, what the temperature was like, all the rest. Again, this level of surveillance, very deep level of surveillance for 1947. And so Dahl is freaked out. And he's like, well, what do you mean? Like, I can't talk about it? What happens then? And then he says, well, you know, what's going to happen is basically your family's going to be in extreme danger. Your wife and your kid, like, just don't do it. And you have no idea, like, you know, you'll be in trouble. So he does, in fact, start talking. And he gets into this whole thing where he's quoted in a newspaper. So he disobeyed the Men in Black, basically. And what happens is his son disappears. Son disappears and doesn't show up till months later. And when he shows up months later, he's working in a restaurant as a dishwasher in Utah. This is a 50-year-old kid is just, boop, he's gone. And he has immense problems. His wife gets sick, and Dahl's life just goes down the drain after this. And
wait, you're skipping over something. So the kid has no memory of how he got there, right?
Exactly.
It's like that weird drug. Was it Nixon's maid or something? His housekeeper?
Yes.
Okay.
That's true. That's a great story as well. But it does seem that in these cases, the Men in Black do possess different types of drugs and that people lose their memory. And in the case of Dahl's son, he didn't remember how he got there, how he got the job.
And he didn't remember who he was, right?
Yes, exactly. So he had a different name, and he called his father. He had remembered everything a few months later and called him up and said, I'm here, you know, and then they go and get him, and he's in Utah. So I think in general, what that tells us is already in place is an X-Protect group is already at the fore. But I'll tell you what's interesting and what may have changed, which is that when we get into the Men in Black generally, John Keel did so much research on them, and by the way, is still the best researcher on them. I haven't seen anything better than his work done. What he said was that when he showed different people, they would all say, you know, the Men in Black kind of looked Asian, and they were all like short, and you know, they had these certain types of characteristics. They seemed out of place, out of time and stuff. But interestingly enough, one thing that they all had in common was that they had this kind of Asian, almost Asian appearance, but it wasn't quite Asian. So Keel got tired of hearing about this, and he was like, I'm going to get all of these different groups, Alaskans, you know, Indonesians, Pacific Islanders, and all the rest, and I'm going to lay them out in photos and see what people pick. But the last group that he picked in there were these group of Laplanders, and they are these Sami people who have an ancient folk tradition and are known for very mystical qualities and things. And he said everyone, when they got to that picture, said, boom, that's them. And I usually show that picture when I do episodes on the Men in Black. But what's interesting when you talk to and read Dahl's testimony, when he's talking about this Man in Black, there's none of that. This guy looks like an American ad executive, right out of the kind of 40s and 50s milieu. And he's very slick. He looks very expensive. He's well tailored, but there's nothing foreign about him at all. So for me, in looking at that, I say that the character of the Men in Black shifted. And later also, the Men in Black seemed to have the ability to pop in and out of reality and to do all sorts of mystical things to their victims. That's much more in line with the Samis, because the Laplander tradition has a lot of that magic. And I have theorized on this program that at a certain point, this X-Protect group enlisted an astral agency to do a lot of their shutting up of the witnesses. And that's where those really remarkable stories of the Men in Black come from. But I think the regular guys are just exactly what you would think, government guys. Yes.
Thermopstraful has some interesting things to say.
Yeah.
Maury Island was fake. Dahl was RCAF and Crisman was USAF. They were flying drugs and bioweapons out of Muller Field near Tacoma. Harold Dahl is in Wikipedia. Canadian spy. Dahl's father-in-law ran Camp X for the OSS.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things about Crisman that spill over onto Dahl, but the incident itself, what happened was the Men in Black basically forced him, because his son was gone, etc., to say the whole thing was a hoax. Later, if you look at Dahl, he's still active 10, 20 years later, and we don't have the ability to interrogate Dahl right now. So if I say, well, he wasn't an intel guy, and you say he is, it's hard. But certainly there are unusual connections around the case, for sure. But the idea that on record, the FBI interrogated this guy and he recanted the case doesn't mean anything, unfortunately. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 114. We're going deep on the Maury Island case, Kenneth Arnold and Jim Garrison. I kid you not, Jim Garrison is right in the heart of this with Fred Krisman. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program, and Miss Olivia is already putting this together. How's the temperature out there?
Great. You want a question?
Yeah.
Rat Boy Genius wants to know, who are the Men in Black working for?
Oh, it's a real good question. Mr. Global.
I was thinking the same thing.
There's that corridor that operates between the intelligence agencies and the aerospace companies. And there's somebody who controls that corridor. But the aerospace aspect is overlooked. And the UFO field that we have overlooks it completely. I don't know why. We put on the record so much in relation to the aerospace aspect, dealing with American political life. For example, Thane Eugene Caesar worked at Skunk Works. All of these people, Oswald said, I'm going to be working at NASA. All of his connections there at Riley had gone on to work in aerospace. The aerospace connection is the key piece, and it's why Garrison's work was so controversial. And it was the thing he kept coming up against that was like, how does this make any sense? When he was studying the JFK assassination, and we have to really kind of look at some of the stuff that Garrison was doing. By the way, that's Crisman there, who was Dahl's boss. Crimson also had another name. Of course, he was a deep intelligence operative, and he worked at Boeing and all the rest. But his other name was John Gold. And that gets very interesting. Also, he has different spellings of his name all through his life. This is a typical trait and trademark, just like you hear about Harvey Lee Oswald and things like that. There is always a variation to show what phase of the legend that they're in. And this has to be kept in mind. Crisman in particular, it has not been unraveled, and it relates all the way up to today, believe it or not, with some of the things that are embedded in the software surveillance world. And I'm going to get into that as well. I want to bring in a couple of interesting people here.
I got to throw a question at you.
Yeah.
Okay, so Rat Boy Genius has a follow-up question. Why would esoteric magicians like the Men in Black work for Mr. Global?
Well, I mean, the same reason that Crowley worked for the British government, you know, I mean, they pay them very well. And not all esoteric magicians are on the right-hand side of the screen. A lot of them are on the left-hand path of the screen, and they do things out of self-interest. And some of them, you know, are kind of in between. You think of guys like Rasputin or something. He had really incredible abilities, and, you know, the Tsars hired him for his magical abilities, but he also had kind of a bad personal reputation. So it depends. But certainly people who are below par on the character scale can pick up pretty good esoteric skills and misuse them. There's tons of cases like that.
There's shamans and there's sorcerers. Very simple.
That's true. But are all sorcerers bad? I forget.
No, but I think it's how I divide them in my own mind.
Witches. There's a lot here, and what's fascinating to me is I've related my own frustration in looking at a lot of this research, and here's one of the things. The people who study the deep state, who understand the government aspects and how they'll use things like assassination or discrediting, surveillance, and things of that nature, that's one group. And they study things like political assassinations of the 60s. You know, they understand the JFK assassination, all the different assassinations that have happened all the way, you know, Wellstone and all the rest of it. JFK Jr. So that group understands how the government works in that regard. And then the UFO people, the people who study that track, they seem to understand things about government censorship, and that, you know, they want the files and all that, but they don't seem to understand that the government has a program of disinformation that, you know, so if they get involved with CIA people, they're not going to get anything near the truth. Whereas deep state, you know, if you told a deep state person, hey, you know, the CIA is going to give you JFK stuff, they would be like, oh, they're just going to let themselves off the hook and give me a phony story. They know that. So it's a much savvier and better educated group who study the deep state aspect versus the UFO file researchers, who can be kind of ad hoc and seem open to anything that gets them attention. You know, and unfortunately, that's kind of one of those aspects that happens around the UFO side. So, you know, and you get a lot of that, like the whole entertainment, like the Corbell, TTSA circusy stuff. You know, that whole piece has nothing to do with scholarly research. That's just trying to get a buzz. So, you know, and they can even work with cases that are interesting, like Lazar's case can be interesting for sure. But if you don't approach it on a scholarly fashion and show, well, you know, on the other hand, this guy's story is interesting, but a lot of the things behind him fall apart. How much of it is true? So you get a kind of a balance going. Instead, they're just cheerleaders for anything that gets them, you know, media attention. That's the worst type of researcher. And we're surrounded by them on the UFO side. The deep state researchers very quiet, actually, and predominantly like doing the research, and they like having the edge, so their research is much fuller. But unfortunately, they're not interested in the UFO file. So over and over again, when I deal with the deep state people, I'm like, this is all very interesting. By the way, I have this whole thing about UFOs, and they're like, well, I really like all your research and all the things that you do, but I can't deal with the UFO thing. And then if I go to the UFO people and I say, well, the CIA are like, you know, basically in the business of assassination. You sure you want to be taking disclosure from them? They'll say, oh, you're paranoid, you know, and, you know, you don't understand, you know. So you have a big problem in these fields. Now I'm going to introduce a third problem, which is neither of those fields seem particularly interested in the supernatural aspect around this. And that's pretty big and pretty major. When you're dealing with the Men in Black, understanding the supernatural aspect, the magical aspect, the occult aspect, if you don't get that in relation to the UFO thing in politics, you're missing a pretty big piece of the picture, and you'll never really put it together without it. So you need all three. You need the deep politics, the occult side, and the UFO aspect all to work together. And unfortunately, those groups all work on different sides. So if you say to somebody, well, here's some interesting information for you, and this came from a psychic, I'm going to read it all out to you. And if that person is a deep state professor, they're not really interested in what a psychic had to say about it. So you get into a conundrum where you come up against different people's boundaries around how they like to get information. But I don't think it helps us get any closer to the truth. So we find ourselves then having to adopt a quality where we embrace mentally the psychic side, the deep state political research, and understand the big picture around the UFO file. And we don't have the boundaries in between. We just study it and understand it as a whole, and you get much closer to the truth. In fact, part of the problem is that, when the CIA is out there, they're trying to gobble up the different spaces and control them. So the consciousness studies, you'll find them very interested in that. One of the things that the TTSA was doing, they were buying up and working with Native American group stories about human origins and things of this nature. That's a really big problem because the CIA seems obsessed with the human origin story. So you can see how if we're going to get to the bottom of things, even like Maury Island, you have the mystical aspect involved with the Men in Black appearance. You've got the deep state aspect involved, as I'll reveal here, with Fred Krisman, who is a Boeing deep state operator. And then you have the UFO part of it, I think, is undeniable. And the case, I think, is a very solid one. In fact, one of the things that happens after Arnold gets there is some military intelligence people come down to talk to him about the case and everything that he's found. And he learns from Crisman, after talking to Dahl and Crisman, that they have actual debris that landed on the ship. So they put them in these cartons and they give them to these military intelligence pilots, and off they go. And those guys have no time to hang around. And Arnold makes a real point of this. He's like, they just really wanted to get out of there. They didn't wait at all. And he's like, I wanted to talk to them. I wanted them to stay overnight and all that, but they just take off. And the plane goes down and explodes. So the material itself burns up. But it creates this problem. So you have a UFO sighting, which gives off this slag and burns, the guy's son, destroys the ship. And then he gets involved. He tells some people. Kenneth Arnold comes down, checks it out. Then the military intelligence people come in. They get the material packaged up in cartons, put it on a plane, and then the plane goes down. So now it's a whole different ball game, and Arnold himself is starting to get afraid. And I'm going to pick up this story actually with a couple of other quotes from Arnold, because the book gets really fascinating, and I highly recommend it. And again, he wrote this in 1952, and I think it's largely overlooked, although his sighting isn't overlooked. But what he had to say about what happened to him afterwards really is. And a lot of it's mystical. Make no mistake about it. So here's an interesting thing. So these bad things happen, and he has another military intelligence guy with him, and he's like, let's go back to Dahl and see what his opinion on all this is, and let's talk to him about his story again. And when he gets to Dahl's house, things get very interesting. So he's talking about this military intelligence guy. He says, I remembered we were standing on the curb, and again, this is Kenneth Arnold, the pilot who had the UFO sighting, that I had forgotten to tell them about the anonymous letter Harold Dahl had received after his story became known. The night I had gone to Dahl's secretary home after he handed me the piece of lava-like rock. He had been using it as an ashtray. So this UFO gives off this weird slag, and Dahl is using it as an ashtray. He got up abruptly and started scratching through all the papers in the kitchen. He was looking for a letter. He said this was interesting. When he returned to the bench a few minutes later, he told me he couldn't locate it, but it would give me a brief synopsis of its contents. Dahl said that this anonymous writer told him that flying discs were actually manned by beings such as we, only less dense, so to speak, than we are. Due to the atomic explosions, the radiation now released in the atmosphere had caused those things to become visible to us on Earth. And this is interesting how advanced this is. These flying discs, which were all shapes and sizes, were the vehicles which the gods of this Earth used to protect this Earth from outside dark influences or enemies. Actually, flying discs were and had been for thousands of years the protectors of life on Earth. The letter went on further, Dahl said, to say that these beings which manned the flying discs were under severe attack by other beings who are enemies of the people and life on this planet. Dahl got this letter in 1947. So, I mean, the sentiments are quite unusual for that period. The impression I got from what he told me about this letter was that the flying discs were somehow the intelligence called gods by the Indians and by all those who claim they have appealed for help from them and have received it. I thought of this while saying farewell to Davidson and Brown. I remember I felt happy at the time that I did not mention it to them, since they apparently lost interest in the investigation. So, you know, what's happening is Arnold is telling the story of the things that happened with Dahl, and the military intelligence people are getting more and more tuned out. It's almost like they're not clued into what happened. So later, what happens is he goes to go back to where Dahl was, and he takes the military intelligence people to Dahl's house. It's only 3 days later after he's originally interviewed Dahl. Dahl gave him this warning and said that he got warned off by the men in black and all the rest. And then the plane goes down. And then he goes to take these military intelligence guys back to Dahl's house, and he finds the entire place is empty. And then they're like, no one's lived here in years. And he's like, what do you mean? I just interviewed the guy here 3 days ago. And he said, no one's lived here. Look. And there were cobwebs everywhere.
Wow.
So obviously, somebody wanted to lock down the story hard at that point and actually even discredit Arnold. Then Arnold is completely disillusioned. The military guys are like, what's going on here? You had a plane crash? You talked to this guy, he's imaginary. Now what? So Arnold's like, I'm getting out of here myself, finally. And the name of the chapter, I think, is I'm Getting the Hell Out of Here. And he goes to take off in his plane, and the plane goes up about 50 feet, and then the engine goes cold.
Oh, my God.
And then somehow he's able to land it because he's such an expert pilot. And he gets out, and he has another engineer who he calls in, and he looks at it, and they had turned off the fuel to the engine. And he said the only person who could have done it was me. So I didn't do it. So they wanted to basically bump him off after his sighting and after his interview with Dahl. That's how sensitive the Maury Island case is. So a lot of people get into, you know, what happened and what were the craft and all the rest of it. But if you study and explore the ramifications after the fact from this kind of honest broker in the middle, Kenneth Arnold, you can see just how heavy this kind of ex-protect line is around this case. Very heavy. So what happens is...
Oh, wait, before you go to that, I have a great question.
Yeah.
So James Clemens wants to know, DJ, could Men in Black be, quote, time police sent back to protect events in time to avoid paradox chaos?
Well, we can ask Dan Aykroyd to answer that question. There's a weird story. Dan Aykroyd tells a story, totally straight-faced, about having a major, there was a major Hudson Valley sighting in the 90s, and Aykroyd was one of the witnesses. And after that, he had kind of weird things about UFOs. He even did his own UFO special. But he'd done a show for the Sci-Fi Channel, which interviewed all these people on the UFO File. And then after shooting for 4 weeks, they called him up and said, that's it. And he was like, what do you mean? He's like, when is the show going on? They're like, we're not going to do the show. And, you know, they shut him down. And he went downstairs at NBC, he said, and he said he was going to host Saturday Night Live, and he had Britney Spears on the phone because she was the musical guest. And he said, and we know he has a sense of humor, and yet he said this totally straight face. He said that these men in black were across the street. They were dressed in 1940s clothes. They had a 1940s car, and they were giving him a terrible look, like, don't ever mess with this stuff. And he said that he looked around, looked back, and they were gone. So here's an interesting thing about the Men in Black in terms of time, which is it always seems like the cars they show up in are brand new, but they're brand new models of cars from like 1947, 1948. And their clothing and their hats and all the rest of it seem to be from that era, even though they're impeccably new, like they were, kind of straight off the rack. So time-wise, I think there is something interesting to look at there. And a lot of people have stories like Aykroyd's, which is why I don't blow it off as just a celebrity having fun. And he's also had some really, he's done a couple of specials around UFOs, so I think he has some good understanding of it in general. That's pretty good. All right, let's see how much we can get in on this tonight. Garrison. There's Jim Garrison. Oh, look, Garrison did something even more amazing with his research into the JFK assassination. And you would say he was doing really well before he encountered the Kennedy assassination. He was the New Orleans DA. He had won twice, been elected twice. He'd been in the Air Force, and he was also in the FBI. So he had an impeccable record. And by the time he encounters the JFK case, he himself has had, this experience of being in New Orleans and being the DA there. He knows all about corruption. The CIA is there. The Secret Service is there. There's massive mob presence there. So he's a very savvy guy around these things. But when the JFK case hits and then it's over with, it takes him 3 years to digest the facts around that case before he opens a case himself. And what happens is that he speaks to Russell Long, who's the son of Huey Long, who's a senator out there in New Orleans. And Huey Long was assassinated, by the way. He was the governor who was a real kind of man of the people type. And, he was going to challenge FDR and all this. He gets assassinated at a train station. That's like maybe around 1940 or somewhere. And Russell Long is his son. So he's very sensitive to the assassination aspect. And he starts talking to Garrison and he says, interestingly enough, when they did tests on all that, Oswald wasn't even up there and they didn't have his fingerprints and all the rest. And he starts opening Garrison's eyes about the whole thing. Garrison's like, oh my God, all those things that I heard right after the assassination, I thought there was something strange about this. And so it's that 3-year incubation period of that information. What happens is he thinks to himself right afterwards, that the summer before the assassination, Oswald was there in New Orleans, right in his zone. And he said, I'm going to investigate it, but I'm going to do it outside of the public domain so that they don't know, nobody knows what I'm up to. I can really study these guys. And what happens is, from originally thinking, this is just the CIA and oil men doing it, he keeps running into NASA. He keeps running into aerospace. He keeps running into Boeing. And so these aspects bother him to the point where he calls up the editor of Ramparts magazine, who he's been feeding this information to. And this guy's trying to be getting away from him. And because he's like, Garrison's going to get me in trouble with this. And he says, take the calls in the mailroom. They won't think to tap the mailroom. And he said, this is poor security, but I'm going to tell you anyway, it's not Texas Oilmen the way we thought. This is the aerospace wing of the military-industrial complex. And here are the people, and here are the companies. And he listed General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. These are the files that the Central Intelligence Agency keeps under lock and key because they can't show how they boxed in Garrison's investigation. There was a assistant to the CIA director, who was Richard Helms at the time, who was notorious for his assassination plots around the world. And his assistant said they employed every strategy. They used every strategy that they could to take Garrison down. That meant discrediting witnesses, discrediting him, using the media, and all the rest. And, you know, Garrison got through that trial, but when you see him afterwards, they hit him with a bribery charge. They take him to court for this. And, of course, you know, he gets through it and all the rest. But basically, the case kind of destroys his life. So the movie JFK, when it comes out, is a great, you know, achievement because it goes back and looks at his life. But his life was kind of destroyed there. And he did get to live long enough and even have a cameo in the movie as Earl Warren, which is hilarious. But I think that when we're looking at Garrison in the 60s, we have to take a real snapshot because what he does is he runs directly into X-Protect through the figure of Guy Bannister, Fred Krisman, and these different figures. Bannister was the FBI chief of Chicago who was running a private eye network out of New Orleans. He's using Oswald to infiltrate left-wing groups. He's an extreme right-winger. And so the idea of Oswald working for this guy is unusual. But Garrison goes into that. He finds that Oswald had an office at Garrison's, at Bannister's place. Now, this is an interesting thing because, of course, the intelligence connections around Oswald are dramatic. And that's a big piece of the Kennedy story. And they always leave that out. They never talk about it because the general story in the media about Oswald is just, oh, he loved the Soviet Union and he wanted to be a communist and all that stuff. But he worked for Bannister. So it doesn't add up because how can you work for this hardcore right-wing guy if you are a leftist communist who is, you know, into living in the Soviet Union? So it just shows the nature of the double and triple agent aspect of Oswald. Now, in the case of Bannister, he is investigating the dinosaur aspect of the Kennedy program, which is there are two tracks in the Kennedy program. There's Blue Gemini and there's Dinosaur. And Blue Gemini is where Kennedy sends in Robert McNamara to say to NASA, look, I don't know what you have going on there with two parallel space programs, but there's only supposed to be one. That's the secret space program. It's the first mention. And there's a document that came out on this in 2015 for the first time, or even hear about it. So the secret space program, voila, is born. By the way, I have a funny story. You know, this is the kind of day that I had today. LinkedIn sends me this message, right? And it is at the very top of LinkedIn. They say, do you know Corey Good?
Oh, good.
And it's a big picture of Good. And they're like, join Corey Good's network. And right beside it, it says head of the Blue Chicken, blah, blah, blah. Unbelievable.
They didn't say Blue Chicken.
It does.
No.
It says in his own thing, it says Blue Chicken.
Wow.
So that's, you know, at that point I looked at LinkedIn and I said, I don't know. I don't think I'm going to use this. So that was pretty good. So when we're looking at Garrison encountering these figures now, he's encountering Bannister, but he was in the FBI with Bannister, so he knows him. And at the time he was in the FBI with Bannister, Bannister was doing what? Bannister was the FBI guy for UFOs, and he created the X designation. We call the series X-Steganography because of the X designations. They use X-Steganography in order to say, hey, look, we're talking about this thing that we're not supposed to be able to talk about in public. But if I say X, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's as simple as that.
Do we know how he got that gig or when he got the gig originally?
He got it in 47, right when the UFO wave hit. And probably he got it because, you know, he had such a good reputation as the head of the FBI in Chicago that they said, we can trust this guy.
What do we know about his relationship to Howard Hughes? Anything?
Well, Hughes does come up. You know, Hughes comes up in the assassination of Parsons. Hughes and Bannister, that's a good question. I don't know if there's
something
anything
to follow up on.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's interesting, too, because there are newspaper reports that you can see of Bannister going into these different towns in Oregon and in the Pacific Northwest generally. And he's investigating the saucer sightings, and they'll be like, you know, FBI inspector out to check out UFO sighting. And in some cases, he'll have a model of a craft and he'll be holding like a model of a spaceship. So he's deep. He is like the originator of the X-Files for the UFO files. So he is X. Now, Garrison knows him well from back in the UFO days. And Garrison was an agent who had to also trek around the Pacific Northwest. So you might even, we don't know for sure, but it's conceivable, since he knew Bannister, that he was actually working with him on the UFO aspects, because he seems to know the aerospace UFO side really, really well. Now, the next person who shows up in this mix that he's familiar with is Fred Krisman. So Crisman is the person who I just mentioned, that Harold Dahl, who was part of the Maury Island case, that's the guy who owned the boat. And he's also the same guy that Kenneth Arnold questioned and all the rest of it. He had been in the OSS, and he had a weird background. There are letters that he wrote into one of these magazines that tracked really weird, strange things. And it was all about when he was in the war, that he had come across this Lemurian civilization in a cave. I kid you not. So again, there's a mystical aspect playing in the background with Crisman. And when they get Crisman on the stand, there's so much steganography from when Garrison questions Crisman in relation to what? Not in relation to any old UFO case. What is he talking to him about? He's talking to him about the JFK assassination. Somehow, Crisman has come up high on the list for Garrison to look into for the Kennedy assassination. How does that work? Well, we're going to get into this. I want you to take a look at this picture. This guy is named T. Edward Beckham. And it says, make plans to see and hear the knowledge of the Lord. And in there, he has a Star of David, the cross, and a swastika. But Beckham and our friend Crisman were deep associates of Clay Shaw. And Shaw was the person that Garrison thought was involved in the JFK assassination. Shaw was one of the military people that von Braun had surrendered, and his scientists had surrendered to. And he was a real deep state player who was involved with all the Permindex, World Trade Center stuff. And the person who he called immediately when Garrison nailed him for the JFK assassination and arrested him was our friend Crisman. Now, Crisman is there in the first UFO case with Maury Island, and a lot of this work, I want to say, was covered initially by Ken Thomas on the Maury Island case, and it's often imitated. And I want to point this out again because I have a little bit of an issue with this when it happens. But we all know Peter Levenda, and he does a lot of work around these types of things. And actually, I like his books dealing with, the Manson trial and things of that nature. But
Sinister Forces.
Sinister Forces, mm-hmm. Yeah. But he joined also with TTSA, and that was kind of a problem, I think, for him. But, writers do what writers do. What I don't like is that the work that he did around Crisman and this whole aspect of David Ferry and Crisman and the Garrison piece all came out of the research of Ken Thomas. And Ken Thomas was really the one who did this. And very often I see Ken Thomas's research on that. See, Thomas really focused in just on that period. So he's really there in the 50s and 60s, locking that stuff in. And but he wrote in the 90s with Steam Shovel Press, and he's still around. He's a great guy. And but it's interesting because a lot of people almost, drop in his stuff verbatim, plop it in. And that's what I saw in Levenda's work on this. And I said, well, there's no mention of Ken Thomas in the book, so you can't use the guy's whole research and not cite him. And, so I see that a lot. And I think in this case, Ken Thomas's work around Maury Island opens up a lot of this. So I can cite him as a source for the work I'm doing on this. All right. So interestingly enough, Crisman has another very strange connection in all this. Before I get to it, I'm going to read what Crisman had to say. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Why don't you, Miss Olivia, give us a little something?
Well, Kontiki Man earlier wanted to know the name of the book, the Kenneth Arnold book.
It is called The Coming of the Saucers, and it's really his definitive book. Later, his daughter would write a book about the strange, almost poltergeisty stuff that happened around him. That one's harder to get. All right, here's a couple of interesting pieces that I'm going to get into here. I want to mention this about, I'm going to jump ahead for a second. I want to mention this about Crisman, which is Crisman was partners with a guy named Reconnaischuto. And Reconnaischuto's son would become one of the biggest software programmers and sought after by intelligence agencies. And that's Michael Reconnaischuto. Now, what happened with him was he claimed that the CIA had asked him to build backdoors into software that they were giving to different countries like Israel and Germany and other allies, because apparently they wanted to spy on them through the software. So he built all these backdoors. And after he did it, he got busted for running a meth lab, which he claimed was an unfair bust and all the rest, and that they set him up. But interestingly enough, from prison, Reconnaischuto detailed a lot of this information about what he did. And the software is called, get ready for it, Promise software. And we know all of the interesting things that happened in relation to the Promise software. Well, Reconnaischuto, there's another piece there that I'm going to give up before the show's over. But keep that name in mind. And remember, Promise software is basically how we got into the surveillance mess that has taken us right up to the present day. And let's keep in mind the connection again. He is the son of Crisman's business partner. Michael Reconnaischuto has that direct connection with Crisman.
It is so tangled. It's so hard to keep it straight.
Well, think about that. You think you're studying one thing, and you are like, oh, okay, I'm going to stop and I'm going to read this stuff for a while, and you run right back into the same edge. It's like they have connecting overlaps. And this is what Professor Scott said about the deep events when he did a whole string from going from the Kennedy assassination to 9/11. He found not only did many of the players overlap, but all the systems, the emergency network channels overlap. So that's something to keep in mind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep here in episode 114 of the X series. This is Deep State UFO Wars. Okay, watch it get really deep. So now this is Garrison, and Garrison has our friend Crisman on the stand. Are you ready? So they're asking him, he says, oh, I'm a teacher. And then Garrison says, is this your sole employment at this time? He says, no, I work for an advertising agency also. He said, what is the name of the advertising agency? It's Reconnaischuto. What sort of operation is that? It's an advertising agency that handles quite a few political candidates in any kind of advertising. Are you an officer of the company or an employee? I write assignments for people, political speeches. How long have you been working for this advertising organization? 2 years. Prior to going into the radio station, by whom were you employed? Mostly by Reconnaischuto Advertising Agency. Now, this transcript keeps going here. Hold on. So he's asking him about various people. And remember that I see a lot of the back and forth that goes on in these things is they're shooting steganography back and forth to see where the person is at. So he says, do you recall any of the names of people who were associated with you coming to New Orleans? Because Garrison had tracked him going back and forth between New Orleans and Dallas multiple times in this period of the Kennedy assassination. And he's dealing with Clay Shaw, who is Garrison's chief suspect. And so he's saying, do you recall any of the names of these people you met in New Orleans? So our friend answers, the only one I can remember, I think, was one by the name of Alan Roswell, I believe. And then Garrison says, Roswell Allen? And then the guy goes, I think that was it. Yes. You know, what caught me about this was with Alan, of course, Alien Roswell, but just the fact that Roswell is, you know, this guy is a hardcore, like he's in the Maury Island case. And here he is on the stand defending himself in the JFK assassination. And he says, Alan Roswell. So what's interesting is he is managing musical acts, and this is his cover for going down to New Orleans and Dallas. So we have to remember that when you're dealing with this level of operative, that he has all of these different covers in order to deal with. Advertising agencies, Reconnaischuto. He's working for them. He also, by the way, is a school teacher in Rainier, near Mount Rainier, right? And close by to the school that he works at is the Hanford nuclear plant, which is our, you know, the big major nuclear plant that we had out there. So we have a lot of weird connections and sort of double agent aspects. And what Garrison concludes is very interesting. He decides that what he's looking at in relation to, well, actually read his press release on it because it's quite fascinating, I think, and enlightening. Oh yeah, there it is. Oh, wait, I kid you not. Here it is. That's my LinkedIn today. That's the kind of day I had. It said, do you know Corey Good? Come on, join up, Daniel. Good Enterprises Solutions, DBA Blue Chicken. You and Corey have
DBA Blue Chicken?
DBA Blue Chicken. You and Corey have mutual connections in common. That's right. Get with that Corey Good network, everybody. Boy, I'm telling you, LinkedIn's reading my email or something. Whew. All right, isn't that great? I knew I would find that. Before I get to the rest of his testimony, actually, I'm going to get Garrison's press release on this.
Wilbur Wobbler said that we should respect Wilcock because, of course, he claims to be Edgar Casey. Want to say anything about that? We have a few people asking about how his project is coming along. Are you keeping abreast of the whole situation?
I can't believe that while doing this serious research, you would even want to talk about Wilcock. But I guess by making the joke about Good and LinkedIn, I invited you to do that. No, I don't follow any of that junk. Okay, but there are a lot of, you know, people who out there who are going to, you know, go for the entertainment aspect and play the game and say, oh, I'm Edgar Casey, you know, and all I can say is run in the other direction. And unfortunately, you will, you know, there's a lot of that kind of horsing around that goes on with Wilcock, and I think we've covered enough. All right, a couple of things about Reconnaischuto. I don't want to get off Reconnaischuto just yet. Highly talented scientist and engineer, Reconnaischuto was entering and winning science fairs with laser and sonar equipment when just a child. He has the look of a crazy paranoid who sees conspiracies, but his scientific credentials are beyond question. Yeah, well, he sees conspiracies because his dad was business partners with Fred Krisman. At age 16, he was invited to be a summer research assistant at Stanford Nobel Prize-winning Dr. Arthur Shalow. Remembered meeting him there. It is also worth remembering that his name appears on many tentacles. Reconnaischuto's talent was recognized by a man named Robert Nichols, who hired him for his company, Wackenhut. Remember Wackenhut? This is a deep state operation. The operation was sited rather conveniently on Cabazon Band of Mission Indians Reservation just outside of Riverside, California. This location falls outside of federal jurisdiction. It enabled Wackenhut to engage in activities that would normally cause law enforcement to come calling. Wackenhut Corporation were subcontracted by the Department of Justice to build the back door into PROMIS software. Michael Reconnaischuto was employed to carry it out. So there's a weird thing there with Wackenhut that which is another piece of this kind of X-Protect thing, which is once they get the advanced technology, it's advanced weaponry. And so Wackenhut being this kind of weird private security company, but it's on record that they employed Reconnaischuto. And so when he went and said, well, I built all these backdoors into this stuff, the fact that they put him in jail for 20 years to shut him up under the guise of that he was running a meth lab. And, I don't know if he was or not, but it seems rather convenient somehow that they locked him up.
Is he out? Is he still
He just
alive?
got out. He just got out.
Okay.
Yes. And I hope he does stay alive, in fact.
Do you think he'd come on the show?
He's not talking very much from what I hear, and I don't blame him, but still, it makes you wonder for sure. Okay, a couple of quick things about Crisman. Let me get into that. Crisman got involved with cable TV franchising, which I thought was interesting. And then he apparently ran for office, and he had almost like a Rush Limbaugh show in the 70s, which is another kind of thing. And he wrote a biography calling himself John Gold, under the name John Gold. In the biography, he states that he was the inspiration for the character played by Roy Thinnes in The Invaders. And in that show, he, David Vincent goes around being chased and chasing around after these aliens that look like humans are trying to take over in all of these different industrial situations. I find that pretty interesting. So now here's a weird thing that happens. Just before Garrison grabs him and puts him on the stand, he has started to turn himself into like a UFO conference person. After, he did this thing on Maury Island, and then he never did anything related to UFOs again. Now, 20 years later, he comes out, he began to turn his attention to the events at Maury Island. On July 22nd of that year, he lectured in 67 on the topic at the annual Northwest UPO conference in Seattle. He lectured the group about the seriousness of the UFO subject, a bit disgruntled at some of the carnival-like atmosphere that attends UFO gatherings. Yeah, well, he wouldn't feel much better about it now. He made the claim that he had been the first person to photograph UFOs and that he still had prints of the Maury Island photographs. This is interesting also because supposedly there was excellent pictures of it, but nobody has ever seen them. He discussed the flying saucer slag and insisted that it was quite different from the discarded product of a local smelter works. He talked at length about the press distortion of the subject and how he hoped the true facts would someday emerge. If Crisman was making a bid to become a UFO celebrity like Kenneth Arnold, he did little after that to further the cause. When he finished lecturing in Seattle, a young UFO researcher named Gary Leslie approached him anxiously to get a copy of the Maury Island photographs, and Crisman declined to offer his own address due to his distaste for publicity. So it's interesting that he's there in that milieu talking about UFOs again in Seattle, and then Garrison grabs him and puts him on the stand. Again, there's something with Garrison. He understands the UFO aerospace aspect of the political assassinations that have gone on. There's a big piece that I'll save for part 2 on this involving the churches that were used as a cover for these ex-Protect CIA operatives. And you'll find all these weird aerospace people showing up and passing themselves off as priests and things like that, including David Ferry, oddly enough. So we're getting into kind of like some interesting overlaps there. What I want to say and kind of sum up a little bit is that what we have is Garrison, when he goes to investigate what should be a political assassination, runs into aerospace aspects. But these aerospace aspects have already been, deep in the deep state. This thing has already been going on for over 2 decades. So by the time he hits against it, they instantly know how to shut him down. But the things that he found out and the things that he put on the record are devastating. And these are part of the files that are locked up by the CIA on the JFK side. This is why this is so crucial. If the Garrison records come out, it's not that there's anything in the records that will say, hey, the CIA did this. Although it is interesting, as I put on the record 2 weeks ago, we did a JFK special that recently Judge Napolitano was talking and with Gerald Celente, and he said, well, I used to be very close to President Trump, and I said, you have to release those records, and he promised me that he would, but then when it turned around, he only released some of them, and I called him up and I said, you can't do this, don't let the CIA stop you from doing this. And he said, look, I can't release those records. And Napolitano said, we're not children, Mr. President, you need to do this. And by law, you need to do it also. And he said, Andrew, if you knew it was in those files, like, you wouldn't release them either. I've seen it and it's terrible. So whatever it is that is in those files, and it's interesting because the files have been used as a political football for a long time. And I frankly was kind of skeptical that there was anything explosive in the files, but I thought they should be released because they might have traces of connections. For example, the last batch that was released showed that the mayor of Dallas, Earl Cabell, who was the brother of Charles Cabell. He was the deputy CIA director under Allen Dulles. It showed that he was an actual active CIA asset at the time during that period. So when we look at that, it gives us, I think it puts us in a different state of mind about things. Now I'm starting to wonder if the Kennedys, especially Robert Kennedy on his way out, still Attorney General after his brother died, if he didn't, because he had a lot of sessions there with the CIA director at the time, John McCone, who was an outsider to the CIA. They had already fired Dulles, etc. So one of the things that he did was, I believe, he set something in motion which assured that when the records came out, larger pieces would be known. So they've been able to keep those records quiet, and it is quite ridiculous. It goes beyond absurdity because it's 58 years later. And there's nothing in those records. Their excuse is, oh, it might impact people or operations. It's ridiculous. Most of those countries, like the Soviet Union, doesn't even exist anymore. So there's obviously something inside the file that is leading and opens up a door. So I think we have to kind of keep that in mind as we go. But the piece that I think is crucial has to do with a story by a Washington Post reporter who got axed when he was studying this JFK aspect. His name is Jefferson Morley. He's put out books about the CIA, and he's a really good researcher on the JFK side. He's somebody on the deep state research side I wish we could swing over to the UFO side because we'd have a different field. But it's interesting because he was looking into a group and he kept coming up with this cover name, and he traced it back to an agent that nobody knew anything about named George Joannides. And Joannides had been in charge of the whole Oswald operation. And so Morley sued the CIA for 11 years to get the records. And those records aren't even part of the records that are ordered to be released by Congress by law. That's a separate thing because nobody even knew that this guy existed. But here's what's interesting. He was given the Lifetime Achievement Award by Bobby Inman, and I covered this in my documentary. Inman is the only high-ranking CIA official before recently to talk on the record about UFOs, and he said, yeah, and we know who's piloting them. But he was Joannides was being given this Lifetime Achievement Award directly by Inman. So that crisscross of the man who, was in charge of the UFO file, Inman, working with Joannides, who was behind the scenes operating on that deep state level, is a devastating image. Now, our friend Joannides is dead, so we won't know his secrets. But the records of what he did in relation to the Oswald projects are very definitely in those records. That's what Morley tried to sue for. That's the kind of transparency that's required for a civilization to go forward in an open fashion. Look, even when Khrushchev took over the Soviet Union, like very repressive, right? But he came forward and gave a big speech about how Stalin had been a dictator, and they kind of tore down some of that stuff. And then years later, Gorbachev was like, yeah, we need a glasnost, and like, let's throw out the way that we used to do things and start a new society. I mean, here we are in America, and you cannot get anything from the CIA relating to the Kennedy assassination from 58 years ago. Come on. It's ridiculous. What kind of an open society is that? It's not. And they always have good excuses. And Biden is like, I'm sure we'll take a look at it again in 2023. Who cares? He'll probably be dead by then, frankly. I'm surprised he lasted this long. Replaced by Kamala Harris and Buttigieg. That's where they're heading. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, we're going deep now. Okay. We're going to be taking your questions shortly. I have a couple of things to get to.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Roosevelt Media News wants to know, wouldn't they have destroyed anything noteworthy in the JFK files by now? Here's
what I'm thinking. I thought so too. However, the Judge Napolitano conversation with Trump has me thinking something else, which is that Bobby Kennedy was incredibly clever, and he may have embedded a mechanism for the truth to come out around this inside the record. And I think that there is precedent for this, and I think that they would be happy to release those records if it was just, here's a lot of junk that we did to destabilize governments in the early 60s. I don't think that they care. And I think that there's something in the mechanism. The thing is, just like, committing a murder, covering it up, and getting away with it as an organization is pretty dramatic, especially if you are a constitutional agency, which they're not. But, if you're charged by the Constitution to defend the country and you assassinate the president, or members inside assassinate the president, it would probably dismantle the CIA, and they know that. But the fact is that they serve at the pleasure of the country, and so therefore they can't hide the fact that they assassinated President Kennedy. It's made it's created the entire deep state freak show that we're in right now. The fact that they were able to get away with that, and then further on kill his brother and MLK and the rest. So there's a civil war, but it took place in the 60s, and our side lost. So they installed Johnson and they installed Nixon. That's a different regime. So that's the way that it was, and they can't really ever live up to that. So they've tried to put out cover stories. One of the things that they're very good at lately is, pretending to have transparency around UFOs and pretending to have transparency around the Kennedy thing. And they're like, oh yeah, we think there was Russian involvement, I mean, that's not transparency. That's more of their psychotic covering up. I had something on that. This is Brennan, right? Suddenly, John Brennan wants to know all about UFOs. Let's think about that. Brennan's like, that government needs to release records. Look, you are the government. What are you talking about? You were in there as CIA director. You could have released anything. This is psychotic.
Well, and why would he come out and say this as if he's a member of the public and he would find out about it when we do? Right? Exactly. If he wants to know, he has his own methods of connecting, finding it out for himself. Yes. And he's not in the business of sharing.
Definitely.
It's just, people just don't take the time to think about these things. It's so obvious.
It is remarkable. Well, and think about the things that these CIA directors have been involved with around UFO secrecy. And then you get a few people who are counterintelligence people, and now they work with Avi Loeb. So the CIA works with Avi Loeb, who was in the Israeli version of the CIA for a decade. So, it's all just like the intelligence people pumping up the intelligence people and them getting each other complimentary books, movies, TV shows. All right, fine. So they're corrupt, and that's that. But then this field shouldn't go along with that. That's kind of a problem, right? So how do you get a field that isn't corrupt and working with that? That's the first thing that you need to do. Second, you need to create larger awareness within the public to get the kind of transparency that gives the incentive on the side of the politicians. Now, I pointed out the Tennessee congressman, and he was like, I'm against this new Pentagon version of a UAP thing. And then you have all these other CIA people pushing this ASRO, right? Anomaly Surveillance and Resolution Office. Avril Haynes, who they call the Drone Queen, to John Brennan's Drone King, because she would look for any excuse, any legal excuse to drone civilians. So those are the people who now want to say, hey, we're going to embrace you and give you the alien story and your human origins. Come to us. We love you. You know, I mean, these are people who drone people at weddings and stuff. I mean, that's what you're talking about. And you could say it's under the auspices of their jobs, but even people who, you know, were pro-Obama and stuff called him the Drone King and thought he was a psychopath. Even those liberal journalists had problems with him, and he lied to Congress also. And Haynes, who is the director of national intelligence now, she wants to head up this ASRO thing. And she had a UAP day with Avi Loeb and all these other people. So that's the CIA push around the UFO threat. They want to take it over, and they want to become, you know, mommy and daddy. And then they want to, when they get you to that point, they can say, oh, these evil aliens are here. We'll protect you. Hide in your house, you know. And when that op gets there, when they get to that point, and they've hinted at it really strongly, and the media has been going nuts with the UFO thing. Suddenly they love it, right? But these people want, you know, when you see that many people talking about the UFO file, you've got this guy now, he's a congressman in Arizona. His wife is the mayor of Phoenix, okay? Suddenly he's like, we need a UAP office, right? Where are all these people coming from? Where did they come? Do they believe in UFOs? How did this even happen? What have they heard? Do they know that there's a big cash cow coming? Do they know there's a big op coming? Kind of like the people who knew all the vaccine manufacturers were going to be rolling out something as soon as that thing was ready to roll out. I mean, you have to start to ask what's going on. Who are those people? Where are they getting their information from? Yes.
They've been approached, obviously.
Yes.
And it's sort of like to be ambassadors of the truth, right?
Right.
You know? And then you have to look into why them. Right? Little Marco is a real question. Like, why him?
Marco Rubio, Kirsten Gillibrand. Well, these are Democrats and Republicans, right? And they don't have any great history of transparency, for sure. So who are they, and why are they being elected for this? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X Series 114. This is Deep State Space Wars. It takes you have to be able to traverse from the 1940s era to the 2021, 22 era, and everything in between if you're going to get the crisscross on these. We're going to be taking your questions here momentarily. I have a couple more things to lay out. And like I said, I'm going to do 6 parts to this Deep State UFO Wars. So we've only just begun. Couple of interesting points here, which is, you know, classically, I'll tell you, here's how we can get the UFO file over to the deep state politics. You know, we've said it many times in this program about Douglas Caddy, the attorney for the Watergate 7. All right. So the Watergate issue still has never been explained. Nobody knows why those burglars went in there. And the idea, oh, they were replacing a bug, it doesn't work that way. You send one guy in to do that. So why were there 7 people involved in that? What were they doing there, and how did they get caught, and all the rest? We've done some study on this. But Caddy was right in the middle of it. And his best friend was E. Howard Hunt, who ran the operation for the Nixon White House, but he was also working for the CIA. So before he goes to prison, as we know, he says to his friend, when Caddy asks him what happened in the JFK case, why did he get assassinated? You know, why did they assassinate him? And Hunt, who was the CIA super spy, the top guy for a long time, and then running operations directly in the White House, he says John Kennedy was killed because he was about to give our most vital secret away to the Russians. And Caddy says, well, what's the most vital secret? And Hunt says the UFO file.
Alien presence.
Yes, that's it. So this is it. You know, he's telling him that that's the piece that they can't be made public. And if a high official like that is do it, then they are within their rights to consider him a national security threat and take him out. That is the crisscross of the UFO file and the deep state operation part. That's where those researchers on either side can get together. But unfortunately, on the deep state level, people, even though Caddy is the Watergate lawyer, they're not comfortable with the UFO aspect. And then on the UFO side, they're dumb. You know, it's stupid stuff. They want to run around after Elizondo. It's an entertainment for us. It's George Knapp and Tom DeLonge and Blink 182. I mean, why don't they have Caddy on? You know, Caddy's still alive. How about having him on to talk about how his friend, the CIA super spy, had said that Kennedy got killed because the aerospace, you know, wing of the CIA said he's going to give the UFO file to the Soviets. That's how you get somewhere. That's how you move to the next level. Instead, the reporting around the UFO thing. See, here's the problem. The independent world, the independent research world missed the boat by not hitting hard enough with the UFO file and letting the CIA run them all around with TTSA and all that. Now the mainstream media has the issue and they can do their own weirdo, you know, uninformed version of it. And you have these kids, you know, working for the Atlantic, these guys in their 20s, and they're just going through this stuff and spitting it out there. And it doesn't make any sense because it's all CIA narrative. And it's all like, well, Elizondo was the whistleblower who brought all this stuff forward. You know, when Elizondo is the one who's a counterintelligence agency who's put out there by the CIA. So you'd have to sit down that person writing for the Atlantic. They wouldn't care anyway because the publisher wouldn't let them say the truth. But you'd have to sit down and say, look, one, if you want to understand things about the UFO file, you have to understand a group like X-Protect who would block it from the very beginning. But why would they block it? They would block the information in the UFO file for a series of reasons, but you have to look into the X technology reason. Because what is X technology? You know, forget about even my terminology about it, but just think about it. What does advanced technology do if it's given out to everyone? It changes the paradigm of the culture. So the X technology is also the Tesla stuff. And he said, what? You can beam energy wirelessly, just like you do communication. So your wireless phone, which he already had in 1911 or whatever, he could beam energy the same way you beam Wi-Fi. Well, then that ends your whole power paradigm on Earth from all those people who have been living at the top of that oil pyramid. And that's one really big problem. So you can see that this is how you get deeper, and it's that kind of culture-wide conversation that needs to take place, because instead you're going to get this goofy, ooh, maybe it's a UFO and not a Russian out there, you know? Or when the CIA wants, they'll be like, those are Russians and they are over our facilities. So now we have the opportunity to go like build up more nukes against them, you know? So you'll always have that kind of stupid conversation if we don't wake up. And unfortunately, that the UFO group failed, really. So I think what you need now is a group of UFO file researchers, and they just, you know, won't deal with the freak show around the CIA thing. Okay, we're going to move on from that. Okay, we're going to take your questions here momentarily, Miss Olivia.
David Termina, DJ, is it the alien presence that prohibits the revelation of itself?
I don't think they're very anxious to reveal themselves. So yes.
Can we really get down to it? I mean,
yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to throw this one at you too. El Barto says the alien presence is code for secret Nazis, which a lot of people believe.
Well, I don't think what Hunt was telling Caddy had anything to do with Nazis, although, you know, I think that the whole thing about Nazis and advanced technology getting into NASA, as we've done the shows with Dr. Joseph Farrell, his work indicates that they were more advanced. Can't we look back and just say, like going back to World War II, you know, it's obvious that the Nazis were more advanced technologically. It's, you know, they were so far ahead of us. They had cell phones. And they had television, of course, in 1936, which is how they televised the Olympics all around Germany. We didn't get it till 1950. So obviously there's a technology curve there. And then we grabbed their scientists. The Russians grabbed some of their scientists. And we went along. The question is, that outfit was there an outfit that escaped with advanced technology to Argentina and, were able to create torsion physics and things like that with the Bell technology? And the answer, if you look in Farrell's work, is yes. So that represents a different player on the field. So the question is, how does that fit into the world that we know? I want to say this about Garrison. I think I missed this point, which is when Garrison was pressing the case on the JFK assassination, he was running into all these aerospace interests, which was weird to him. He didn't expect that. But he was bumping up against something. And the thing, it's hard because he tries to articulate it himself. He's not quite sure. It's like it's got these different tentacles, and all people can see on top is like, oh, there's mafia and Castro people, whatever. That's all very bottom level stuff. What's really going on, and what is that apparatus about? What are they protecting? And so he comes in contact with X-Protect directly during the JFK assassination and afterwards. And it's because when you hit out really at the JFK assassination, you're hitting out at the aerospace corridor of the intelligence community connection. That's the thing, because that gets to the advanced technology and it gets to the global control. Those are the pieces then that we need to pick up on and work with. So when you see Lockheed Martin and Boeing and all these guys running the show, and they're controlling all the data in the United States, and they're controlling all the satellites and stuff, you have to wonder, this worldwide global dictatorship and the surveillance capabilities and the nature of this, we have to get to the defense contractor aspect and the aerospace wing of that and their history involved in the deep state assassinations of our political leaders. That's key. I don't think you can get very far without it. There's one thing, and I mentioned this, and it's in the Torbit document. And the Torbit document, as I've said, is like a 1970 version of WikiLeaks, but very extensive. This guy was very connected in the Johnson administration. And one of the things that he says that I think is very compelling is he mentions a group called DISC, which is Defense Industrial Security Command. Nobody knew what this group was. So I'm just going to read a little bit of what he said that they are, and then we'll go into your questions. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the DISC was a police, security, investigative, intelligence, and employee clearance arm of the sprawling military-industrial complex consisting of the Atomic Energy Commission, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, and the employees of all these agencies. It is not in the least surprising that the syndicate and the mafia worked well into the Defense Industrial Security Command because of their members' ownership of many in the huge corporations manufacturing munitions and supplies for the Pentagon and Atomic Energy Commission and NASA. So Roy Cohn is identified as a big player in this. And Cohn, I think it's important to note, was a major force for Donald Trump's political life. And he, in fact, set him up in Manhattan, and he couldn't have had the Trump Towers and all the rest of it without Cohn. But Cohn is always a weird match with Trump because Cohn is like a real deep state operator, and Trump had always come off as being outside of that group, or at least part of a different deep state than what we were used to with the kind of empire, American empire around the world, wreaking havoc in the Middle East and all that for oil benefits. Certainly Trump was different from that. He had his own deep state connections, but the Roy Cohn aspect always showed up as a weird one. And here we have Trump creating the Space Force, which is just having its first birthday now, creating the 6th Armed Services Wing, which is a huge move, which no one had done. And now the Space Force is going to be charged with developing and divulging UFO information. This was Trump's attempt to pull that UFO file back under the wing of White House control. And that's a crucial piece of the UFO war that's being missed, because The CIA has it through the aerospace corporations. Remember the privacy of the aerospace corporations. They have aspects of that technology that they don't need to reveal because they're not a government agency. So there's a weird alliance inside the deep state of those intelligence groups and the aerospace companies. That's the corridor that we seem to be up against. That's the thing that Garrison bashed into in the late 60s. And it comes through when you get things like DISC. You can get that piece, that figure. Oh, okay. Now I know. I've got some idea. It's still very mysterious. And again, in my opinion, you need to employ deep state knowledge, UFO knowledge, and mystical knowledge if you're going to get anywhere to really understand it. And with that, Miss Olivia,
hold on, I got a troll I got to get rid of.
I love it.
It's one of these little sex butt things. Hold on. There we go. Okay.
I like that without clothing. I mean, could you come up with a juicier, snazzier line with that? And it's like, guess what? It's without clothing.
All right, Debbie McAdoo. How does all this connect to the breakaway civilization? They kept the tech and are using it to go off planet?
Oh, I think they want to. They want to go off planet. There's no question about it. And I think, what's weird is if you check out Bezos' comments recently, he said, oh no, people will live in space and Earth will be like a resort. And instantly my mind flashed to colonies, slave colonies in space, and like them preserving the Earth for the elites, and Mars being a new slave colony and all that. I mean, this guy, whenever he gets, we've researched Blue Origin in this program. There's tons of X-Steganography in there. He's in competition with, our friends Tesla. And, so the Musk X-Steganography, these things, they all operate with that technology. They've all signaled to each other. We have it, and we have the green light from Mr. Global to exercise this. But there's a lot of misconceptions about space and what we can do. For example, they're saying we can go and we'll mine an asteroid and all that. Farrell points out really well that you can't do it with chemical rockets. You're not going to be able to land on something, drill it, and then take all the goodies home. So something else is going on. There's a different technology being utilized. But all you need to know in terms of how to foresee what they're going to do and what they've been up to is that we last went to the moon in 1972. Doesn't make any sense. How could you freeze a space program for 50 years? What would you do? You still were getting a regular budget for that stuff, and you had a black budget for it. So where did it go? Where did all that development go? The only thing that you hear about it is Reagan says, we're going to do Star Wars in 1985. The Strategic Defense Initiative. And we're going to be able to zap nuclear missiles from space. That's one reference to the development that we were doing, but it disappears. And then you hear, thank God, about the NASA hacker. And he comes forward and he says, I've got lists and lists of off-world officers that NASA is listing. Where are they? What are off-world officers? Where do those people go? Solar Warden, all those programs that are mentioned by whistleblowers on the real side. And then later, all that information gets distorted and whipped up in a blender by Gaia TV and all the rest of it. And they even plagiarize the work that we do here on this program. For a time, they really push it. But I think when you look at that, you get a real snapshot that there is an off-world program that we've paid for. Fitz has this picture, and it's a stock certificate for UFOs. And, it's like, sign the name of the U.S. citizens, because the UFOs that they've developed to go into space, whether it's reverse technology or whatever, that's the money that we paid into the program. So fine, they can reveal it, but we get a stock in it, they can do it, whatever it happens to be. But this is the interesting thing. They're just cutting off the people who have paid into these programs, just like they're trying to get rid of the long-term programs, whether it's Social Security or Treasury bonds or whatever, all the legacy things that people have paid into for generations and their families. They're trying to make it an attractive idea to get rid of that stuff. And because they don't want to do it. They don't want to pay just because people have paid into it. There's a classic story about Ronald Reagan having this meeting with David Stockman in the early 80s and saying, okay, let's look at Social Security. And Stockman says to him, look, there's nothing in there but IOUs. And Reagan's like, what do you mean? People have been paying into that thing since 1933. He said, look, it's all IOUs. So all the money that people have been putting into it is kind of like the Teamsters Union Fund, which was, they were always using their own money and emptying out all the money that people were putting into it. This is the type of thing, this is why the missing trillions work is so crucial. It's why we're in the middle of all this, because when you tie in the advanced technology with the missing trillions, with a better understanding of that political structure, you can see that they're moving all the assets to the top. They're moving all the power and control to the top, and they're stopping you from talking, even on platforms like this, about the things that really matter. Thank God that we still have this ability to do it. But of course, I just had 2 videos censored with Dr. Farrell. They took down an old video of me with Fitz. They took down a video of me with Jim Mars about 9/11, the late Jim Mars, who was a great researcher. And that was from 2016. So, that whole machine, the censorship machine, is on such overdrive that we have to just appreciate the fact that we can have this conversation. And trust me, I do. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep, deep here. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Jordan Banner, how does the CV plot fit in with the UFO agenda?
CV? Oh, thank you very much. So the op, I think that they're running them parallel. They're squeezing as much as they can out of the whole lockdown freak show. And, we've seen a lot of that fall apart with a lot of really good experts coming forward and blowing it apart. However, what they ran during the height of the lockdowns, as I said, was a rerun of these videos that Crisman and Elizondo put out of the Tic Tac and all that stuff, which was really terrible footage. And the cases themselves had occurred in 2004, and the footage had been available on YouTube in 2007. So the whole thing is really like, it's such a scam in that sense. Whether you think those films are real or not, they had already been available. So it was almost like they just repackaged it and were like, let's dress this guy up and it's a whistleblower and make the New York Times get behind it and get some photographers in here to make him look really sullen, man. And, but it took them 3 years. And I think that they've done a lot better with the op that they're running right now than they have with the UFO File op. They haven't ramped that up yet. And like I said, if you thought the COVID op was something else, just wait till the UFO op gets really rolling.
Can we just bottom line this? I mean, we've talked about so many different sci-fi movies or episodes of The Twilight Zone or something like that. So what is this the most like? What do we know for sure? Or what do we suspect?
It's a lot like They Live.
It does seem to be that way.
Oh, yeah.
And so then clearly, here's what we know. So I'm scared to say this because you never know when we're going to be censored. So they are definitely here's what they think is that there are too many of us humans, right? And so when we think about the agendas going on here, there's definitely a depopulation agenda going on, right? It's clear and obvious. And the climate change situation is part of that.
No question.
So I think we don't know how it's going to play out in detail, but we know what their intentions are.
Someone in the chat says it's a cookbook.
Exactly.
Woo. Yeah, I'll tell you this, which is what they're trying to do is they're trying to normalize the fact, just like the Wall Street Journal reporting on camps, right? They're trying to normalize the fact they're like escapees from the camps, right? So in Australia, which I've pointed out before as an international crisis, I don't know why it's not the top agenda of the UN. And, you know,
what do you mean you don't know why?
Well, no, really. If it were a real functioning unit, then the fascism that's taking place on the citizens in Australia, it's outrageous. It's outrageous. And we hear more and more stories about it. But the camps idea, I've shown it to people who are, you know, kind of in the matrix, out of the matrix kind of thing. And they don't want to believe it. And then I showed them one because, you know, I worked at the Wall Street Journal. I brought it to them and I said, look, this is a Wall Street Journal article. Look at it. He's talking about camp escapees. You know, there was a bridge too far that happened. I pointed it out on this program where the New York Times, it was Twitter censored the New York Post from the Hunter Biden laptop, which was a complete scandal and was horrifying. And it's amazing that they were able to lock it up. It shows that the censorship is alive and well. But in censoring the New York Post, Twitter should have been, you know, it should have been an outrage across the board. And they should have been forced, you know, morally forced to their knees to reform that. Instead, they replaced Jack Dorsey, who was bad enough, with this other guy who says, we're not going to be thinking about free speech. We're going to be thinking about the times that we're in. You know? So, you know, we have fundamental problems with the platforms and the way, the control of information. But that was one kind of a line that got crossed. And I think the place then that we find ourselves now is the camps thing is what the next piece that they're trying to push. Now, there was a bill that the Tennessee governor tried to sneak in there, which also included funds for one of these, you know, sort of quarantine detention center things. This is the line then, you know, the camps are the line. So you've done all this other stuff, you know, mass lockdowns and all the rest of it, but you can't start having people thrown in camps because that's never again Holocaust. And then there was an EU head who came out. She said, you know, we ought to just get out of that whole Nuremberg thing. It's a different era or whatever. Hey, babe, you know. So, you know, you can't, as a world, you can't go back into camp mentality. That's something that we got through with not just the Nazis, but the Soviets. And, you know, I'm sure it's still done in North Korea, but is this North Korea or Australia or America, whatever it happens to be? The other question is, why are they using Australia as such an example? So these are the things that need to be at the forefront of reporting.
It's an island continent also. I mean, if we were bordered and we wanted to, I don't want to say invade or something, we wanted to rescue them or something, if, you know, we could.
A lot of people think in terms of this.
Yeah,
right now.
you know, we can't get to them. Nobody can save them.
Amazing. And this really is incredible. And I'll tell you, they are targeting the Aboriginal communities there.
Breaks my heart.
It's phenomenal. And to think of the power, you know, the Aborigines have tremendous power of a mystical nature. And so, you know, I think a number of things can happen in relation to that. But Australia, I mean, you know, there's no way I'm going to be quiet about that. It's, you know, I feel like we need to be aware of those things. We've been tying things in. You know, this show is about the deep state UFO file wars. But let me tell you that all they look for are emergencies that can give them unlimited fascistic powers. And so the UFO threat idea is something they've been building for a long time. The group that's been building it is deep in the heart of the deep state. And the Central Intelligence Agency has a lead role. So when you see their lead players out there trying to panic the public or stroke the fascination with UFOs or whatever, you know, that's a really big red flag. And so that's the way I think we need to look at it. Yes, Miss Olivia.
This is interesting. So Schmuckles XRP says, I think they're desperate on so many levels. The quote magic cootie op was launched like only a month after Maxwell was placed into custody. And David Tormina says, DJ, Michael Reconnaischuto is connected directly to Robert Maxwell.
Yes.
And the Promise software Ghislaine Maxwell trial happening now seems to signal major events happening in the UFO file, doesn't it?
There's no question about it. I agree with both of those. That second one is interesting, and I'm going to bring Reconnaischuto and Maxwell together in the next episode of the Deep State UFO File Wars. I am looking to see the things that come out of this trial. It has the potential to let loose some really powerful things because you never know when you get into a trial. However, there also could be a gigantic whitewash there where they're just trying to say like, oh, evil Epstein was a pervert, and we're just going to leave it at that level. We're like, oh, what an evil guy Epstein was with his weird little island. Yeah, but what was it all about? How about the fact, we have an episode here, it's episode 100, and it's Ghislaine in the hot zone, right? What was she doing with Epstein? They had really intense underwater activity aimed at what? Finding ruins in the hot zone. Why is that a big deal? Well, we've covered the hot zone extensively on this show. What is it about the hot zone that is the sole focus of the lives of these people? And it is those ancient ruins off Cuba. So that's a crucial piece, and tying that back into the things that Casey was saying in relation to land rising and the ancient advanced technology. That piece I was reading earlier from Albarelli, well, there were some quotes from him, actually, I was going to read. And I'll read this real quick because it relates kind of directly to your question. Respected writer and former Newsweek editor Evan Thomas writes in his book, The Very Best Men, that William Colby, an OSS officer who later became the director of Central Intelligence, credited Frank Wisner, the former OSS officer who founded the CIA, with creating the atmosphere in order of the Knights Templars. Okay, to save Western freedom from communist darkness. Other prominent early CIA officials strove to perform work worthy of the Knights Templar, to belong to a cultish crusade. Sound familiar? Frequently, the agency characterized itself as the good guys versus the evil empire. Yeah, except they were assassinating people left and right. But, they gave themselves the mantle of being the good guys. Several heavily redacted CIA documents reveal a keen interest in the Ark of the Covenant, Solomon's Temple, and the peculiar apparatus reportedly witnessed by Ezekiel. Ezekiel's vision is a biblical passage extremely important to Jewish mystics. It has also been a source of fascination and mystery to many of the UFO community. Biblical passages around the rock of Horeb led the CIA to investigate the science of dowsing to locate concealed springs in water. Think about that. Think about the CIA going out and doing dowsing to locate water. And other hidden sources of valuable natural resources. One document reads in part, these subjects without doubt appear strange and extreme, but one cannot escape the reality of their effects and impacts. Exploitation of a thorough nature is wise and may well prove beneficial in a number of areas. Thusly, concerns about appearances or ill comments should be put aside, but caution should be exerted at every step. For some time, researchers were especially interested in the work of psychic Edgar Casey. The TSS is a group inside the CIA that does this kind of esoteric research. TSS researchers were especially interested in the work of psychic Edgar Casey. According to one document in the early 1960s, consultants acting covertly, in other words, planting CIA agents, were employed to spend time at the Association for Research and Enlightenment, housed in Casey's Virginia Beach, Virginia headquarters. Related to these esoteric and occult explorations is another CIA-requested task for Mulholland. Quote, an examination and explanation of certain of the Masonic designs and architectural features incorporated into the federal city. Among those listed for examination were the Capitol Complex and the Zodiac at the Library of Congress, and particularly interesting considering John Warner's appearance on this program, and the recently installed melon fountain, which they found all this Masonic stuff overlapping. So you see this group, then you can't just understand the CIA from a deep state level because they're studying mysticism. So how does anybody approach them without understanding that they consider themselves Knights Templars, for example? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep here in X Series 114. We're taking your questions. We're going to take about 10 more minutes of questions, and it's great having everyone with us. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter, and that keeps us in touch regardless of the censorship that we see going on. And we definitely, feel like that kind of instant communication between us beyond the platforms, which are here today, gone tomorrow. We're happy for the platforms. I'm just happy to be here on this Friday night speaking with you right now. Miss Olivia.
Mint Key, am I right in thinking Epstein was also interested in eugenics, transhumanism? Didn't he want to impregnate women with his DNA?
About literally like about 10 minutes from here, this is an interesting thing about Epstein and Ghislaine is they spent a lot of time right around here. And but one of the offices that he would go to over at Harvard was to study this idea that he could sort of create this super DNA and mix it with his and impregnate all of these women at his Zorro Ranch. Now, this is a deep subject, but I think when you're getting into when you get a guy like Epstein, you're getting a flash, just a little flash of what these people are up to, and you have to keep that flash in mind and think about the things that he was really noted for. And you have to get into the blackmail aspect, and you have to get into the spying aspect, because there's no question that there's all sorts of spying pieces in relation to Maxwell. Maxwell is buried in Israel, and he, that's Ghislaine's dad, and he died under very suspicious circumstances, nude off of his own boat. He was definitely bumped off. And so the threads for Ghislaine and Epstein, when you get into it, though, what you're running face to face with is the name of their submarine series is Atlantis. The name of his ranch, Zorro, he has all of these unusual Atlantean formations. They know the hot zone. They're taking scientists, like Stephen Hawking's down into the depths to study these things. We're looking at a group that is very esoterically knowledgeable on one hand, but seems to have no compass, no moral compass. And that gets us back to our original quote about the CIA that we started with in this program, which is, there is no truth. This is a rule motto that they have in there.
Well, and it's like there is no God, right? Therefore,
there
are no rules, right?
Exactly. The truth is whatever they make up. So that's why Fauci comes out and lies, has multiple different explanations and just lies. It's just lying. Stepford Biden comes out, just, it's just lying. Jen Psaki comes out, it's just lies. And these aren't just political lies. I think Americans and people around the world always kind of gave a little wink at things that people would say politically and being like, Americans need to live up to their best truth or whatever, and we could take rhetoric that was hokey and just seemed like it was said for the heck of it. But I think the kind of bald lying that they're doing now, anytime they run into a problem, and their own approval ratings are in the tank completely. If you think about it, the polls that favor them have them either in the low 30s, or they have the vice president, who can't seem to offer anything in public when she talks. It's just bizarre. But her approval rating is 28% in a poll that's favorable to her. So these people have reached the lower limits of anybody respecting them at all. So it is a very small minority that's pumping up this machine, but they still hold mass levers of power. And so I think the thing that we need to do is wake up and throw off the yoke of oppression. Especially electronically, we have the ability to do that legislatively. We have the ability to do it through protest. We have the ability to do it through our actions. Look, we're on Friday. It's Cash Friday, right?
Right.
Did you use cash today? Keep using cash. So this is the nature of the thing. It sends a wave. And someone thinks, oh, they're in charge of everything. There's nothing I can do. It's not true at all, And I remember when, the Germans used to tell their soldiers that they could not talk about Patton. This is very interesting because when they talked about Patton, they got incredibly defeatist because he was known to annihilate, and nobody wanted to face off against Patton in World War II. And, they had their own good generals on their side, but whenever they got to talking amongst each other, they were like, oh, Patton's going to just wipe us out. We can't do this. How can we even cut through those lines? Patton's there. So they triggered off a thing saying, you can't discuss Patton. You can discuss Eisenhower, all these other guys, but you can't talk about Patton when you're among your own lines.
Was Patton the one who believed in reincarnation? And then
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And he also was key to fooling the Germans into thinking that they weren't landing at Normandy by creating those plastic tanks and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And he was quite interesting. And of course, he survives all these incredible things. And when he comes back from the war, he's killed in a common street accident. It's very, very odd. So Patton's a whole answer in himself. But I think that we have to look at that. And I also think there's a lot of mysticism in the Bible. And one of the stories relating to David and Goliath is there and there for a reason. It's crucial because there is that weakness in the giant. And in the case of David, the way that the story is told, he's 15 years old with a slingshot. The odds are pretty bad, in other words. So, yeah, I think that stuff is there definitely for a reason. Yes.
Okay, so Diego Rivera says, underground bases to hide the elite after UFOs attack, laser weapons, high technology, massive psyop war.
Wow, absolutely. Let me explain something to you. We do a lot of programs on continuity of government on this show. If you study continuity of government, the only person I think who's really brought it out is Professor Peter Dale Scott. There are others, but they won't go as deep for political reasons. But Professor Scott is like, here's everything that's available about continuity of government and the Doomsday Network, which is where it came from. So Continuity of Government Network has the ability in an emergency, used to be nuclear emergency, they took the word nuclear out. In an emergency, they have the ability to take over the entire government in America. So the continuity of government then would have regional governors and military commanders. And they would use the emergency, and the person who would head it would be the person who is the general at Northcom. Right now it's Van Herk, and Van Herk is famously from the 509th Bomber Squad, which is also the Roswell Bomber Squad, which I think is funny. But those rules became so secret, and it started off with the idea, well, it has to be secret because the Soviets can never respond, and the Russians should never know how we would respond if we were bombed in a nuclear attack. But that became, if you study it over decades, an underground government. So it became a covert government, and you had an overt government up here. But this thing became bigger and bigger, and at a certain point, things went like this. So now we're dealing with the continuity of government players. I'm not saying that they're totally in control, but they have their fingers on a lot of the levers because they've been able to operate in secret. Now, it's my contention, and this is just my interpretation based on knowing about continuity of government and the secret space program, that they applied the laws to that underground secrecy, where you couldn't even mention it in Congress, that they took that underground secrecy and they applied it to space, so that space became a non-constitutional place. So they could do anything that they wanted to in relation to space. So the continuity of government then applies to what? An underground government here that could survive any emergency and take control. But now they've applied those rules to space, which is why 50 years of no development. Now we're not going back to the moon, not so fast. and just private entrepreneurs now being able to go up there and privatize space, right? Where's the space hotels guy? He's still paying George Knapp's hotel bills, right? So that's the thing that I kind of key into based on your question. Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm going to come back around to this. Actually, I'll ask this question first. James Clements again. Does DJ think they want digital currency to enslave us with negative interest? Does he think it's coming?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I think the people who try to promote digital currency were doing it because they wanted to get out of fiat currency. But unfortunately, digital systems are not to be trusted. And I would much rather have a $100 bill in my pocket than a digital $100 bill, because, under that system, they can, as soon as you become a political dissident, just shut your money off. If you say something, Fitz makes the great point. If they don't want you buying pizza, you're not buying pizza. So that's a problem. Now they have something, but they've had these systems roll out like Bitcoin, and it's exploded, and some people love it, and it's a religion and all the rest. And that's all very well and good. But the thing that they're building are the CDBCs, right? The central, or CBDC, the central bank digital currencies. And they've on record at BIS Bankers, and I've played the video in my interview with Fitz, and she's coming up here soon, where he says we'll be able to track that money when it comes in, when it goes out, and we'll be able to control it. And so, basically you can't do anything without their approval. That's the system that they want. Then nobody can, they can starve out anybody who opposes them. That's the danger of just having a digital currency. That's why it doesn't work as a total solution. People want to incorporate Bitcoin and try to get the illusion of freedom from fiat currency. That's good. I can appreciate that. But I've never bought into that system. I'd rather have the cash system, because if I lay down, this is something that Catherine Albrecht used to talk about. She said, if I lay down my $100 and you lay down your $100, that's it. But if I lay down my digital money and you lay down your digital money, and the government doesn't like me, but they like you, then there's an imbalance. And then they can shut off the money of people they don't like. Look at the thing that they did to, they're already doing it. They're doing it to independent creators that they don't like through Patreon and things like that. Let's think about Julian Assange. What was the first thing that they did? They shut off all of his donations, right? So you find yourself needing an alternative. So inevitably, there's going to be digital forms of everything, but you have to be able to have the hardcore thing. And if you can have a physical asset that represents it, so much the better. Yes.
Okay, Shashakila. 2 things the elite want: to own the planet and all on it, and immortality. I think we better talk about that a little bit. I think everyone in the ideas room would agree that that is what we're dealing with here. And they kind of don't care how they're going to get from point A to point B, how they're going to achieve that. Oh, so they don't care how many people they kill. We're all guinea pigs,
Oh, they're proving that. They've lost, in a way, like the 800-pound gorillas out of the closet. They lost a lot of the cover that they had, which was like, we care so much about people. Now they're like, that's right, you can't do it. If you don't do what we say, you won't get, like, stay behind in your house and we'll throw you an Amazon treat. So you have, someone was talking about New Zealand earlier, and the incredible things that they've done there to push around their citizens. Jacinda, and her psychotic routine. Again, there's a weird psychosis in the eyes of these people. Jacinda in New Zealand, of course, Trudeau in Canada. We've pointed out Gavin. I mean, well,
these are all World Economic Forum leaders,
trainees,
right?
Yes.
We know this, right? Okay, so we know where it all traces back, that there is an agenda, and they've been placed in positions of leadership for a reason to implement this. We don't know what to do with that information yet, quite. Well,
you have to know who you're dealing with, for sure. And now we certainly do. In the case of, for the leadership in America, so they have Stepford Biden, but the thing that's behind him is what I'm very interested in. And I think Avril Haynes represents that very well. You know, that intelligence arm. And I think that intelligence arm, they want the UFO op. This is why it's such a crucial thing for us to understand, and also to give a background on where does this stuff come from, and how did the CIA interfere with it, and why is the deep state interested in the UFO file at all? They have a great interest in it, and they've been, you know, masters of deception around it, even very early on. Remember when Arnold is doing his whole thing, and just going back to Arnold for a minute, you know, this is a guy who is just a regular pilot who sees unusual craft. He doesn't know anything about the games around it. He doesn't know that he's going to be surveilled. He doesn't know that the pilots that he gives the Maury Island slag to are going to go down because their plane is going to be sabotaged, or that his plane is going to be sabotaged. So this is the difference between us here as private citizens, just trying to get a handle on things and seeing something unusual in the sky like that, and the ramifications of what happens, versus the game that's really going on out there. So it is in our interest to understand what the real UFO file thing, not a Politico article. You know, I see these good UFO researchers and they're like, look, Politico's talking about UFOs. Hallelujah. I mean, come on. You know, those are terrible articles. And if anything, you should write to those people and tell them that's not what the UFO file is about at all. It has nothing to do with Elizondo. What are you talking about? He's a CIA agent for 25 years. You know, how can we expect someone who's in the employ of the Central Intelligence Agency to give you the truth about the UFO file? Who, you know, I see this over and over again. I invited Elizondo on this program for a debate. I sent him messages. I put it out publicly. They won't touch it, because if he comes on here, I'll demolish that operation in 2 minutes. It takes 2 minutes to demolish the entire operation. It's very easy. You're currently working for the government. Yes or no? The answer is yes, if it's honest. 2, in that capacity, as working, does it include the Central Intelligence Agency? That's a yes. 3, if the Central Intelligence Agency orders you to lie as part of a public operation, since you're a counterintelligence officer, are you not compelled to do it? That's a yes. That's the end of the operation. Forget about GQ heroes. Forget about all that junk. It's over. 2 minutes with Dark Journalist and Lou Elizondo's history. That's why he'll never come on this program. It's that simple. That's not me thinking that I'm something great. Anyone could ask those questions. George Knapp could ask those questions. The GQ guy who was fawning all over him could ask those questions, but they don't want to. They have their own marching orders. So those people, we can't rely on them for the truth. So we have to look somewhere else. I'm not going to waste time thinking the guy who is the interviewer for GQ is a bad person. I just don't have any time for it. I want the truth in the matter, and so do you. So that's where we're at this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. Okay, 2 more questions, Miss Olivia.
Okay, these are linked. All right.
Yes.
So IB Crypto. I think the deep state has anti-gravity, but all alien stuff is a psyop cover for fake alien invasion. So, and then Shamanist Anamkara says UFO files probably have the deals made between our government and the reptilians. We are dancing around the reptilian issue. Whether they are reptilians or not. It seems to me that there's technology that the elites have been offered. I've actually tweeted this basically, and that the way they have sort of it's almost like a quota to fill. They have deadlines.
Yes.
And so they're getting there. Is this what the World Economic Forum? Is this who they answer to? Who's really pulling the strings? Who's really Mr. Global after all? Who's running this planet?
You're right. You're right. But here's the thing. You have to ask the question. See, it's very easy for them on the political reporting level to be like, oh, it's the reptilian tinfoil hat wearing crowd and blah, blah, blah. All right. We don't even talk about reptilians on this show. That's not really the point. Here's also the point, a crucial aspect, which is the UFO file's real. Okay. Off-world visitors are real. some other strand of entity, interplanetary or interdimensional. Something is visiting there that's not, that is foreign. So that seems very clear. So that's the position that we take on this show. So when we're trying to roll back the UFO threat thing, it's not with a cynical, oh, don't believe in UFOs, it's all a CIA psyop. It's that they've taken something which is so crucial and manipulated it for their own purposes. And they would do that with anything, just like the idea of responding to, you know, a worldwide illness, right? They would still use that as their own power thing. They can always take the threat and piggyback something on the back of it, just as this is what Professor Scott has pointed out. So, you know, you had a terrorist threat, and then they piggybacked the op of 9/11 on top of it to get all that control and the excuse to go into the Middle East. So it's not that the threat doesn't exist, it's that they've taken something and used it and appropriated it for their purposes. It's why it's crucial. Look, they're so deep and they know so much about the UFO file compared to the average person. However, they'll never share that with the average person. So the average person should never go to them as a source for it, because their job, the way that they see it, the Knights Templars, upside down, their job is to keep that information and to deceive you about it. Therefore, if someone's an honest researcher, they can't sit side by side with CIA people to get to the truth. I mean, you have, you know, there are people who get out of the CIA like Ray McGovern, and the CIA harasses them, you know, and they, you know, they show up and they get, you know, rolled at protests and stuff like that. And they're on the CIA blacklist. That's one thing, you know, but just being like the pet of CIA directors, or like national director, like DNI director Clapper, which Elizondo was, you know, let's get real. You're not going to get UFO truth from those people. You're not going to get it from Mellon. Chris Mellon? You kidding? So, you know, we just have to be real about that. And we can move that field and understand it. Like, we can throw off the liars and that whole track and the ops, but still get to the truth of it. We don't have to throw out the alien or UFO side. That's important research. We need to do that kind of research in this. So remember that when we're doing this, it's not to get cynical about UFOs or UFO reporting, even though there are bad entertainment style stories out there, even though there are bad CIA ops, which sometimes are just grotesque, right? So I think that we need to take a different approach. Look, that the subject is so exciting, and it's brought us to so many interesting things. People have really incredible stories about encounters. Look at the foundational stories like Kenneth Arnold or Betty and Barney Hill. They're really, really interesting stories. But those stories have continued on for a number of different people. The whole kind of saga of John Mack that we've talked about, Professor Mack, and the amazing things he brought forward for people who were having these experiences. The field is very exciting. Unfortunately, the junk conspiracy on top of it, and the CIA op, is becoming a matter of political life or death, you know, and so we need to be cynical about them, but not about the subject. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I just wanted to say, you know, sometimes we can get really mired in the questions, in the details. And I think you can always bring it back to, and this is what I do, like, you shall know them by their fruits, right? What we can, I am an empath. I'm a highly sensitive person, and I know what feels authentic,
yes,
and what feels like justice and love and truth and beauty and all of those higher things. And I think we all feel that. And I just happen to lead with my emotions, my senses, and I think rather than my mind. And so when it comes to people and the standards we hold them to, right? I I hold people to very high standards. I hold myself to very high standards. And I think that the reason we're in this crisis right now as a humanity is that we have not been holding our leaders for centuries to the same standards, right? And that this, I think, is the great awakening that we're experiencing here, is that we deserve better.
Well, it's weird, isn't it? Because the leadership is really upside down. And it seems like my feeling has been that people on the ground have been waking up to a number of different things. And I would like to see the culture move forward. But I think that the leadership is so backward and behind the scene. You know, the level of imbalance has become, you know, it's a schizophrenic understanding, and there's a cycle of disrespect between the leadership and the people on the ground. And that's the thing that can really corrupt a society. And also, I think that leadership class isn't listening. I think that somebody is telling them, just go for it. You know, like, you can roll over anybody and do anything. This is part of the problem with why they went into Iraq. You know, these people were saying in their ears, everyone will go along with it. Don't worry about it. And it became a complete disaster. So somebody has whispered in the ear, you know, it's the Davos crowd. I can hear them talking amongst each other. We'll hit them with shock and awe. They won't know what hit them. But they've bitten off more than they can chew, because I don't believe that they have the technological control to try to pull off the thing that they're trying to pull off. And I think that they think in their backup, their main piece is what Wernher von Braun predicted many years ago, which is the alien invasion. That's the thing I think that they think that they can get away with. And, you know, I guess it's going to be up to us to expose it. And but I'll tell you, right now, we're in the battle of our lives. There's no question about it. You know, I said it to you know, a friend of mine recently. I said that we are in a real war, and it's strange because I don't think that everyone understands that. And but certainly it's a war, and I think the tools that we can use right now is communication about it and our own awareness and interaction with each other. I think there are legislative things that are happening that we can get behind. I think there are movements breaking that we can get behind, and getting the word out is just so crucial. And that's something we're trying to do on this program. And with that, Miss Olivia, I think that we are done. Mm-hmm. Do you have any last?
I know that you wanted to thank someone who sent you something in the mail before I give my shout out.
Oh boy, now you've got me.
I remembered, it's MM.
Yes.
Initials MM.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Also, you support people. Some people have asked how they can support the show, and they don't use PayPal. So I'm going to put this out there for everyone who wants to send a check. And it is Dark Journalist 1770, Massachusetts Avenue, number 238, Cambridge, Mass. 02140. And we really appreciate that. And at the website, of course, you can also get behind us by becoming part of the show. And for all those who gave us Super Chat tonight, thank you so much for making it happen. It helps us to do the work that we do here on your behalf.
I'm going to shout them out.
Yes.
Okay, so Jordan Banner, Gil and Joy R, James Clements, Tomaltuck O'Firigal, Eurythmia's Fun, Mindy Drake, Jim Sarge 3ID, S. Cush, Animal Black, Doreen Hewitt, Rob McTavish, Gigi Abby Lynn, Debbie McAdoo, Roosevelt Media News, Shazam, Jackson, Luke Walker, John Chan, and CAB. If I forgot anybody, but I didn't catch you, I apologize. And I wanted to also say, Jackson, happy birthday.
Happy birthday. Wow. Thank you so much for your support. It helps us to do everything that we do here, and we very much appreciate it. And to all our subscribers, my hat's off to you. We will see you next week. And we have some surprising and interesting interviews coming up for you, as well as along with part 2 of this Deep State UFO File wars. Kenneth Arnold, you know, he really got us somewhere, and he actually suffered to get there. And Jim Garrison, trying to get us that deeper truth, ran into all these things he didn't even expect, and brought us so much information from that. So these are real heroes that we've had and that we can look back to for inspiration and knowledge. And they all had a lot of heart. That's one thing I notice in going over these stories. They're very interesting people.
This is a good one. Don Newway says, Michael James Reconnaischuto, Father Marshall, was a business partner of Richard Nixon.
Yes, yes. Well, we're going to include Reconnaischuto because Promise gets us into the octopus, and it gets us all the way to Maxwell and some of the fascinating and bizarre things that have been done on the surveillance side, which we're only beginning really now to get the ramifications of. And the surveillance runs deep, especially on the alternative research side. I can tell you that for sure. So we're deep in the heart of Texas on that one. We will see you all next week, and watch out again in that newsletter at darkjournalist.com, because we have some surprise announcements coming up for you, and also for 2022 events and some very special changes coming up as well.
You gonna shout out some people?
Yes, okay. Absolutely. Fantastic. Olivia Wings girl. Oh my God. There she is. Thomas Tyson. Yes. Danny Casolaro, a real incredible journalist who was looking into that Wackenhut aspect. And Roosevelt, it's great to see you. Great to see you, sir. James Hadaway. Hal Colombo. David Tormina. Doing great stuff. Najat Madri. You are still awake. Nicely done. Professor Angston. Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Brenda Fisher. Shamanus Anam Kara. Scarlet Fire. Woo, the gang's all here. Jimmy Kennemer. Thank you. Appreciate it. Karen Carpenter. Joseph Min. Jester Kane. Wow. Mermaid Moxie. I love that name. Oh, that's great. Great words tonight, Olivia DJ. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. We had a great time being with you. It was a great crowd, a great ideas room tonight, just giving us that extra boost with the questions, which we really appreciate. We'll come back at you with Deep State UFO File Wars Part 2. And I saw Gigi out there. Gigi, it's great to see you. I just did a Part 2 interview with her, and she just did an incredible live chat. Cannot stress the work of Gigi Young enough.
Gigi is really coming into her own.
Amazing, really.
She's grown so much, and
her work is so remarkable, and it just keeps going out in these ways. And let me tell you, she's a fantastic contributor to the X series. So there's no greater ally out there. So we really appreciate it. Soul Token. James Clements, thank you very much. We will see you all next week, and have a fantastic weekend, everybody. And we'll keep our eye on the AOIMSG, which I'm calling, what am I calling? I'm calling it annoying name anomaly. So I'm calling it Anna, but it's Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group. Hey, hey. Not to mention the ASRO, Anomaly Surveillance and Resolution Office, followed by our favorite UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. Look, it's all about UFO, unidentified flying objects. Let's get real. X-Protect, it's a covert intelligence aerospace group that controls the UFO file. And of course, X-Steganography, what is that? It's an obscure naming mechanism for moving Black Aerospace Projects through government agencies. That's my definition. Thanks very much, everyone. We appreciate it. We'll see you all next week.
Okay, God bless.
Anna. And you know, it says end broadcast, but it never really ends after all.